Alrighty. Apparently, I am now live. So, welcome. Thank you for joining me on tonight's slow chat. I've just noticed my microphone's a bit loose there. Excuse me while I make a few adjustments. And if you could, when you get the chance, could you just type in and let me know that you can hear me okay? You may remember at the last slow chat that I did, actually the last solo slow chat that I did, I ran into a bunch of technical issues. Thankfully, because I'm using Streamyard now instead of going direct through Facebook, I've not had any of those issues tonight, but I do just want confirmation that this little guy is working properly. So if you can hear me, would you be so kind as to let me know that you can hear me by making a comment? You can just make that in Facebook and that'll pop up for me here in Streamyard, and I should be able to see that and get confirmation that this is all working properly. I see a thumbs up, so that's good. That's a good sign. Yep, heaps of people. All right, I've just had a bunch of comments all drop in at once. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Chrissy. Thank you, Auntie Mel, and thank you, Unifrog, for all confirming that for me. I do appreciate that. So I'm using some new software at the moment, and I've been using it for the last couple of times when I interviewed Victor Tay, and when I interviewed Matt Wong over the last couple of weeks. I've used this software and it allows me to do things like this and put people's comments up on the screen, which I can't do with Facebook. I can see your comments, but I can't actually interact. I can't chat with you. I can't put them up on the screen. So this time around, and the aim and the reason why I've switched to this particular software is because I actually want to be more interactive. I want to give you guys more of a chance to have a say, to ask a question. Not that I've got all the answers, but if I think I've got an answer, if I think I can contribute, then I'll do my best. But we can just be a lot more interactive here than with Facebook, where I could read the comments and I could say them out loud, but I couldn't put them up on the screen for people to see at all. So that's the idea with StreamYard. Now, if you're new to Slow Chats, welcome. This is a very particular format that runs in a very particular way. And that way, as the name implies, a slow chat, that way is quite slow. So I have here a nice big mug of black tea, which I will be enjoying over the course of tonight. I also have some Smokehead single malt Scotch whiskey that I'm going to be enjoying. It is, as the name would imply, quite smoky. So I have some Dimple 15 blended Scotch whiskey there as a backup, just in case the smoky Smokehead is a bit too much. And for my personal enjoyment, I have a Rocky Patel Age Limited Rare Second Edition in the Robusto, which is among my favorite cigars. It's not the number one, but it is definitely right up there. So the whole idea with this is I'm going to slowly unpack this question that I posed earlier today about where does a government's power come from? It's one of those questions that I didn't ask myself for the first more than 20 years of my life. And I'm going to tell a little bit of the story, and I've never publicly shared this before, but the story of Topher before I became Topher, who, not like going right back into like childhood, I was born at a very early age kind of nonsense, but going back to some of the more formative years, homeschooling, some of the stuff that I did as a teenager in my late teens that really, and then ultimately also my time in the army, that really set me on the path that I'm on now. And because I'm a very different person to what I was in my 20s, politically, philosophically, very, very different. There's been a lot of journey, a lot of progress made over the time. So I'm just going to, good evening, Topher, hearing you loud and clear from the Sydney cell block. Yes, I'm in District 9, as you'll see from my little signature there. A reference, of course, to the movie. For those of you that know that, Jan is trying to steal my thunder. They get their power from the people who respect their authority. Yes and no. Jan, we'll be talking a lot about that a little bit later on. Linny is saying good choices. I'm glad you approve of my cigar and Scotch choices for tonight. Nicole is saying from God, governments get their power from God, the divine right of kings. We will discuss that a little bit later on. Rodney saying you won't get COVID, smoke or alcohol will fix it. Funny, there were so many predictions that smokers would be more vulnerable to COVID. And then in the end, actually, they've proven to be somewhat less vulnerable to COVID. So I could actually argue that to a certain degree, I am inoculating myself against the coronavirus right now. I don't think that argument would go down terribly well, but I could actually make that argument if I really wanted to. Okay, Glenn Good question. Can I talk about the legislation currently in Parliament regarding political party membership being increased from 500 to 1,500 to minimise options at the next election? I can't because honestly, Glenn, that is the first I've ever heard of it. So I'm going to look into that now that I know about it. Thank you for bringing it up. I can't comment at this point in time. Big business donations and ripping off the people with the unions. There's a lot of that going on. Nickel, to punish the wicked and reward the good. That is the purpose for which God instituted governments. Is that what's happening? That's a very good question. Okay, Wayne, you need a good cigar for the 30th. You need to go to another Facebook page called Cigar Professor, thecigarprofessor.com. I run this with a business partner of mine. We can supply you with some good stuff. That's all I can say because this is a public video and we're not allowed to promote ourselves. So thecigarprofessor.com. We can sort you out for the 30th. Glad to be here. HP 8 Doors, good to have you. Wayne is saying for his 30th. Okay, we can certainly get you that for your 30th. The old doctors were right. Smoking is good for you. I would definitely not go that far. These are very bad for my physical health, but they're very good for my mental health. So I'm a big fan of these things. Okay. So let me get lit up with, I've given a few minutes for people to find their way here if they were caught up with putting kids to bed or whatever else the case may be. So I'm actually just going to slide that right off. There we go. And I'm going to get this cut and get this lit. And then we're going to get stuck into what should be a pretty full-on night, actually. Wayne is saying he already follows me on the Cigar Professor. So Wayne, head on over there and we'll be able to sort you out. I try not to mix up my Topher stuff too much with my Cigar Professor stuff. So I'm going to get lit up. If you haven't already, grab yourself a cup of tea, grab yourself something to drink, make yourself comfortable. I did see the request for there to be a toilet break this time. So at around about 9 p.m., I am going to take a couple of minutes break myself. The stream will continue, but I'll take a couple of minutes break and that'll give you guys a chance to do whatever you got to do, get a fresh cup of tea as the need may be. So yes, I have heard you. You will get I will take a toilet break today. And as a result, you will get one too. I've got here my my Cigar Professor lighter. And what's nice about this, it sort of works a little bit like a Zippo, but it's actually a jet lighter and a soft flame lighter in one. So I'm just going to toast up my cigar. You don't want to get it too close to the actual flame. You don't want to be hitting it with the flame directly if you can help it. The slower you warm up the tobacco, the better. You should aim for light to take you at least a full minute, if not 2 minutes of toasting, just to actually get the tobacco to warm up sufficiently, but not so quickly that it shocks the tobacco. There's a lot of stuff in tobacco that you don't want to be tasting if you can help it. There's literally like acetone type flavors in there, and if you change the temperature of the tobacco too fast, that's all you're going to taste. It's really unpleasant. And so heating up the tobacco quite slowly and giving it time to warm through is a really important part of actually enjoying the cigar. Otherwise, you're going to start off with some really unpleasant flavors on the light up. Beautiful. Okay. That has lit up reasonably well. So what have we got here? So Marie is saying, don't give up smoking. I gave up. Now I've got asthma. So as an ex-smoker, stay smoking. What are your thoughts on vax or not vax? Well, we'll probably touch on the vaccine issue a little bit later on today. And if I don't get to it today, I'm actually sitting down with Matt Wong tomorrow of Discernible. We're going to be talking a lot about that. We're recording tomorrow and he'll be releasing at some point after that. So that will get addressed in the next couple of days. I'm not going to just do it right now, but it may come up a little bit later on today. Governmental authority is the sum of the rights that people have agreed to transfer to the state with conditions. That sounds all very well and good, but there's a fundamental flaw with that idea of the transfer of rights from the people. And that's what I'm going to get to right towards the end after I've gone through a bit of a journey, Ian. So if you haven't got other plans for tonight, stick around, because I think whilst that sounds nice and I would have agreed with it when I was in my 20s, I no longer think that that is correct at all. Nickel asking about the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. That's beyond my scope for today, Nickel, but that is something that I may actually get into. So for those that are interested in this sort of stuff, Google the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. That's something that I think Americans are much better at understanding and trying to uphold, but we don't do a very good job of that here in Australia. So, yes, Damien saying statistically smokers have lower rates of hospitalization. That's true. I think you'd still be hard pressed to call it a medicine, but you could always try and get government subsidies. Try and get it on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. See if you can pull that one off. Okay, let's get started. So, plenty of time has passed. If anyone's not here, then they're not coming. So, all right. So tonight is a little bit part personal story. I'm going to be going back further than what I've talked about before. Many of you will have heard about me talking about Topher and the evolution of Topher from the very first video that I did. I'm going to go back before that because that journey of me from a cookie cutter conservative, which is what I was raised as and what I was for the first 20 plus years of my life, that has changed radically over the years, as you would hopefully see if you've been spending any time on my page. Hopefully, you've noticed I'm not a conservative anymore. I am a libertarian, and in fact, I'm almost at the point of moving out of libertarianism and towards anarchism, which is a natural progression. I'm not quite ready to call it yet, but I'm heading in that direction, and we'll talk more about that later on tonight. And so that context is important for where I'm coming from as we then move into discussing where government power comes from. So it's not pure self-indulgence. There is a purpose to me talking a little bit about my background. But yeah, bear with me. We're going to get to the direct questions of political philosophy and where a government gets its power from a little bit later on. But I think it's important that you understand a little bit about where I'm coming from, who I've been in the past, and who I am now. Not that I think and this is my point, it's not that I'm sitting here thinking I've arrived at the correct conclusion. This is a snapshot. This is a moment in time as I am continuously chewing on these questions and mulling these things over. And I've come a very, very long way from where I was. And I may yet still go a long way from where I am now. So consider this to be a snapshot in time. I grew up as a cookie cutter Christian conservative. And in Australia, what that meant in my childhood was basically anything that Johnny Howard said was gospel, right? He might as well have been a prophet of God. He said we had to shut the borders. Well, we have to shut the borders. He said we had to hand in our guns. Well, we better hand in our guns. He said we're going to have a first homeowners grant and a baby bonus. Well, look at him looking after families, blah, blah, blah. Like that was me. I was that guy. Okay. Now, I'm not proud of that, but that's the honest truth. I was that guy for the whole of until long after John Howard was gone, right? I was so upset and so sure that the world was going to end because Kevin Rudd got into power, right? I was deep into this kind of blue versus red, conservative versus progressive. Not that we use those terms in Australia. It was liberal versus Labor, but I've moved to the conservative versus progressive language because internationally, a liberal is actually a left-leaning person, whereas our Liberal Party, well, I would say is left-leaning, but they're less left-leaning than the Labor Party, the Greens, etc. So it's kind of, we use the word liberal to mean our more conservative-ish sort of kind of party in Australia. So it all gets muddled. So progressives being more your left-wing, that's where your communists, your greenies, your socialists would reside, and then your conservatives, is more where you're in Australia, the Liberal Party claim to be. I would say they're not anymore, and we'll talk a bit about that later on. But that's where they claim to be. But you're more your One Nation type parties and these sorts of guys. Your Nationals claim to be conservatives. Are they really? I don't know. So that's the language that I'll be using. So I was a conservative through and through. Now, Mark Brown has come in and said, now where's my mouse? There we go. Come in and said, Howard was one of our better PMs. Debatable. Very debatable. I'll be talking specifically about specific policies of his that I started out supporting and end up now very much oppose. So that's a very, very debatable point. But I understand where you're coming from because that was exactly my view. That was exactly my view. Do I have the ANCAP itch? Maybe I do, but it's too early to tell, Stuart. So we'll have to see. At the end of the same day, the red team or the blue team are both wings of the same bird. Yeah, or the left and the right boot. Okay, does it matter whether the left boot or the right boot is stomping on your head? You've still got a boot stomping on your head. I'm no longer, I no longer care anymore. So, getting back to my notes. So, having said that, I was very much a good cookie cutter conservative, but I was also very unconventional My parents homeschooled me, and I'm very, very grateful to them. It's one of the greatest gifts they ever gave me. Was homeschooling. It wasn't necessarily easy back then. Homeschooling was even less recognized than it is now, and I missed out on a number of opportunities that school kids will get. I don't regret that. It was just the reality of the time, and I think what I was given and the upsides of what I was given far outweigh whatever I missed out on. The good news is now, if you want to homeschool your kids, they don't actually really have to miss out on much, if anything at all. You've just got to be intentional about it and make sure that you seek out those opportunities. But all those opportunities for sports and theatre and all that stuff, it's all there now, even for homeschoolers. It sort of wasn't back when we did it. We were, as far as we knew, among the very first families to choose to homeschool in Australia. So there's always been distance education, school of the air, that type of thing's been around for a very, very long time. But we were among the earlier families, certainly that we know of, to have actually chosen to do it. And my parents asked me whether I wanted to or not. And I elected myself and my older brother, Jonathan. I'm one of 7, by the way. But the two of us, myself and Jonathan, were very close in age. And we were asked, and if either of us had said no, then they would have left us in school. But we both actually said, yeah, we want to homeschool. And so we did, in my case, from the end of grade 3 in primary school all the way through. I never went back to school. And I'm very, very grateful to my parents for that. So on the one hand, cookie cutter conservative. On the other hand, not afraid of being different, not afraid of being unconventional. Now, in my mid to late teen years, I really got into all the sovereign citizen stuff. So again, this is just talking about my progression, how I got to where I am now, giving you perspective on what I'm going to talk about later on, which is the fundamental philosophy of government and where power comes from. And I got into the sovereign citizen stuff in a pretty big way. I paid and did a bunch of seminars. And then as I got into my teens and early 20s, I started to put this stuff into practice. And I actually got annoyed because I wasn't getting any parking tickets. I wasn't getting any speeding tickets. I wasn't getting, you learn how to do these letter writing campaigns and stand on sovereign citizen. And, I don't understand and the language that gets used and the various sort of games that get played as part of that movement. And I was into it. I mean, I was into it. And I knew all the tricks and I knew what I was supposed to do, but I didn't have anything to practice on. I didn't have any fines or anything to actually work on this and actually find out if it worked. So I actually stopped renewing. I didn't renew my license. I didn't renew my car registration. Like, I was so far into it. I was like, okay, fine. I'm just going to do this. And eventually the cops are going to catch up with me and they're going to give me a fine. I'm going to have something to work with, something to prove that this stuff works. And so I did. I went through that process, and I'd flown to Sydney to buy a vintage motorcycle, a CBX 750. For those of you that are into your vintage motorcycles, 1974, I think it might 1980. I don't remember anymore. Don't quote me on the year. CBX 750, inline 4-cylinder, beautiful sounding thing, classic. The Boldor version specifically, it had all the fairings and the windscreen and everything else. Beautiful bike. And I rode that down via the coast road from Sydney, unregistered, speeding most of the way, overtaking trucks like a bat out of hell. Early 20s, invincible male. Typical early 20s, invincible male. And a cop caught up with me in Sale. And he says to me, so he pulled me over because I didn't have a registration plate on the back. He said, yep, okay, so no rego. Your license is expired. And then he says to me, you don't have to answer this question. But I've been hearing chatter on the CB radio amongst the truckies of some guy in black leathers on a red and white motorcycle overtaking them at very high speeds. That wouldn't happen to be you, would it? And I said, you know what? I'm not going to answer that question. And he was fine. He just said, yeah, okay. And so off I went. I finally had the pieces of paper, right? I could finally do all the sovereign citizen stuff, the letter writing campaign, the I do not understand, and all the various techniques. I see the question there from Biff. I am smoking a Rocky Patel ALR, aged limited rare, 2nd edition Robusto. I have just a few of these left. They're very, very hard to find now. Rocky Patel does one of these basically every year. They're very, very different cigars each year. This was his 2nd edition of this particular cigar. So I then resumed. I then began doing what I'd learned how to do by doing these seminars, the sovereign citizen seminars. And I began the letter writing, and I began the whole backwards and forwards and trying to get them into contract with me and refusing to go into contract with them and all the various tips and tricks and techniques. And I very quickly ran into an uncomfortable reality. that they simply carry on as though the words that you used and the things that you said had no effect. Now, I'm not in a position to say whether or not sovereign citizens and what's taught in that realm are correct or not. I don't know. I think there's a lot of merit to it. I think at a moral level, there's a lot that is correct. But ultimately, if you're faced with a government that simply refuses to acknowledge it and simply moves on, and they just go, okay, you've sent us a letter. We don't acknowledge what was in that letter. We're just going to send you the next reminder and the next reminder. And now you're overdue and now you're in breach and now we're issuing you with a warrant. It doesn't actually matter what's in your letters if some guy with a gun's going to show up on your doorstep and try and arrest you, which they did later on. I'll get to that part of the story. So I see that there's now it's kicked off in the comments now. Some people arguing about John Howard. Well, look, it's all a moot point, guys. Don't get too exercised about John Howard. Was this before or after I chose to join the army? So I got into the sovereign citizen stuff well before, but then the climax of it all happened actually after I'd been in the army for a while and after I'd begun my journey away from conservatism. So my point in bringing all this up is to say I've played that game, and I get a lot of messages in my inbox. I get a lot of comments on content that I put up, people talking about sovereign citizen type stuff. I do understand it. I think I understand it probably better than a lot of the people that are commenting about it, because I studied it, I trained in it, I paid good money to do multi-day seminars with people, and I put it into practice. I literally went looking for opportunities to put it into practice, and I came up against this cold, hard reality that you send that letter and you follow all the rules and you say exactly what you're supposed to say, and it's supposed to have this magical effect, right? Now you're no longer under their authority. Great. But when they show up with a gun on your doorstep, I'm sorry, it's no longer about authority, it's about power. And that was I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the beginning of the epiphany for me, to realize that actually the question of where does their authority come from is a moot point. Now I will be addressing that in my opinion as I go through what my opinion of authority actually is. But in the end, the authority is not actually what's relevant. It's the power that's relevant. So that came to a head. I'll give you the end of the sovereign citizen story as part of another story, but I'm actually skipping ahead past when I was in the army. I think, if I'm remembering the timeline correctly, this is after I was in the army. And so what happened was my parents decided to take on the banks over the issue of mortgage securitization. Now, that might be foreign language to you. You might have no idea what that means. But if you've ever seen the movie The Big Short, and they were bundling all these mortgages together into these various financial asset classes and grading them A, B, C, etc. It was all of that. It was all of that stuff. And my parents decided that they were going to take on an Australian bank over the issue of mortgage securitization, and whether that was actually illegal and whether they still held title, whether the chain of title had been maintained intact such that they were actually still owed money. So Dennis, stick with me for a while, mate. I see your question there. That's a fair question. But you probably missed the very beginning. I have progressed from a very conservative position to where I am now. So I joined the army when I was still largely a conservative. So one thing led to another. They went to court. They lost. And then the sheriff showed up and evicted us from our house. And I was still living at home at the time. I was in my very late teens or very early 20s. I don't quite recall. Still living at home at the time. And the sheriff showed up and threw us out of the house. Okay, fine. So we played all the tricks, we don't understand, we don't recognize your authority, you're trespassing, blah, blah, blah. That didn't make a lick of difference. What we did know, though, was that warrants expire after 3 days. And so about 4 or 5 days after they threw us out of the house, we all just moved back in. We broke back in using we all have windows or whatever that we know we can get in, right? So we did that, changed the locks, away we went. We lived in the house perfectly happily. Now, while we were getting our things from storage back into the house, the cops showed up to throw us out. And this was maybe a day or two after we'd moved back in, illegally moved back in, right? And so I get a phone call. I'm in the car with my brother Matthew, who up until we got evicted only a week before had no idea what was going on. He got completely blindsided because he'd already moved out of home. So he didn't understand what was going on. But he was helping to get all the stuff and to move back into the house, not really comprehending what was happening. I'd been there the whole time. I was his younger brother, but I'd been there the whole time and I was more across what was going on. Mum's at home doing a bit of a tidy and a clean, waiting for us to start arriving with things to move in. Dad's back at the place where the cops took all of our stuff when they evicted us. They removed all of our stuff and they stuck it all down in Rosebud. We were in Preston at the time, so they were just deliberately sticking it, the other side of Melbourne. And we were stuck in traffic, and I get a phone call from my mum, and she's upset and she's crying, and the cops are at the door, trying to throw her back out again, threatening her with arrest, telling her that she's going to go to prison, telling her all kinds of things. And I just said, Mum, you're not. Just hang tight. Don't open the door. We'll get there as fast as we can. Matthew was driving, my brother. So he drove as fast as the traffic would allow. And we got there. And the reason I'm telling you this particular story is because I want you to understand, when I say I understood this stuff and I was deep into this stuff and I was willing to stand on all this sovereign citizen stuff, I mean it, right? I stepped out of the car and there's two police officers in the front lawn and they've seen us coming. So they're standing on the front lawn. And I immediately instructed them to get off the property. And I did that 3 times, which then allowed me to threaten them with a charge of trespass. And when I did that, they then left the property. Now, this was the first big win that I'd had. This was the first time I'd used any of this sovereign citizen stuff, and it had actually worked. I'd tried it with all the letter writing campaigns, and they just kind of ignored me. And they just pushed through their system of escalation towards you getting arrested or you getting a warrant against you. And it was as though it had no effect. Whereas now, all of a sudden, I went through the process. I told them to get off the property 3 times, and then I threatened them with trespass, and they stood off the property, like one centimeter off the property, but they stood off the property. And they challenged me and they said to me, well, you're not going to win this. We've got a warrant. We're just waiting for it to arrive. I said, no, you don't. The warrant expired a couple of days ago and you're not going to throw us out of this property. I know how this works. Well, car after car starts pulling up and there's more and more cops and sheriffs and everything else pulling up. And so I've got Suzanne saying we didn't have mobile phones back then. Yeah, we had mobile phones when this happened. So like I said, I'm not sure exactly how old I was. But I can assure you I had a mobile phone in my pocket. So I'm chatting with the cops there and saying to them, no, you actually don't have the legal authority that you think you have. Just because there was a warrant doesn't mean that it's still valid now. Doesn't mean that it still applies now. And so they sat there and said, oh, well, it's coming, right? I said, okay, great. When it gets here, call me, right? Until then, stay off my property, which they did. So then car after car pulls up and there's about 6 cars there. And eventually they all just got in their cars and drove away. And that was the first time I'd had any sort of a big win using any of this stuff. 6 months went by. I'd had a bit of time to sort of process what had happened and try and understand what it meant about power, about authority, about government, about any of this stuff. And I really wasn't drawing any meaningful conclusions at all. It was just a mess in my head. And then, when was it? It was about 6 months later. The sheriff showed up again. I kid you not, in excess of 35 officers, guns not pointed at us, but they're all armed. Locksmith unlocked the front door, barged in, dragged us out. We were smart enough not to try and fight them, but at the same time, I didn't make it easy for them to drag me out. But nevertheless, they had 4 people, 1 on each limb, and they just dragged me out of the house and threw me onto the footpath, along with my mum, my dad, and everyone else that lived there. So, and then what they did, that's right. So the reason I was mentioning about the other stuff before, from not registering the motorbike, not renewing my license, all that stuff. So then they stood there on the footpath, having just dragged me out of the house, and they served me with warrant after warrant. And this was the end conclusion of all of these other things that I'd gone looking for the pieces of paper to fight. I'd finally got them. Well, this is where it ended up, was me standing on the footpath in front of my family home with a cordon of cops keeping us all out, getting evicted for the second time because my dad had tried to fight the banks over the mortgage securitization issue. and having them serve piece of paper after piece of paper on me. And I refused to consent to the service of those papers. I refused to stand under the authority of the officer that was serving them. He got really annoyed. And then ultimately he laid them on my feet and he said, I deem these to have been served. I said, that's an interesting word, the word deem. Deem means to treat something that did not happen as though it did, or to treat something that did happen as though it did not. So by using the word deem, you're admitting that it didn't happen. If you're deeming it to have happened, you're admitting that it didn't. And I'd be very happy to take you to a court of law on that point, that it did not happen. So I then walked away from the pieces of paper. I never picked them up. So they sat there on the footpath and blew away. And we were thrown out of the family home for the second time. Now, I don't remember exactly when this was. This was after I was in the army, possibly even after I'd left the army. I was somewhere early to mid-20s, I think, is when this would have happened, when it finally came to a head and came to a conclusion. Early to mid-20s is roughly when that would have happened. And then I really had to begin asking myself the question, where does government authority come from? Now, this was a process that was started for me when I was in the army, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But this was finally when I had to go, hang on. A whole bunch of police and sheriffs showed up on my door, all of them believing themselves to be doing the right thing, all of them believing themselves to be upholding the law. A judge gave a judgment against my dad and against my family, believing that he was doing the right thing and that he was upholding the law. None of them had actually any understanding or comprehension of what the actual issue was. The judge who gave a judgment against my dad didn't even understand what securitization was. He just knew that on one side he had my dad representing himself, and on the other side he had the bank with all of their lawyers and everything else, and he just sided with the bank reflexively, right? Now, as they say, anyone who represents themselves in court has a fool for a client. Sure, that's a pithy line. It certainly was true in the case of my dad. He would have been much better off with representation. But where does that money come from, right? And this is one of the big problems for a lot of us when we try and fight the government. We go all in. Our entire life is on the line. We're up against a couple of career lawyers, barristers, and what have you, who really have no skin in the game. And we just get railroaded. We get run over. And I saw that with my own eyes with what happened to my dad in that particular courtroom. But here are all these people working for the state, working for the government, believing themselves to have the legitimate authority to throw my family out of that home when none of them even understood the grounds upon which my dad had actually decided to fight and to try and stand up for something. So this was where my own transition away, and transition, of course, is now a word that's used in all sorts of other contexts, but it's the correct word here. This was my transition away from being a conservative. So I was a good cookie cutter conservative with this weird independent streak and this kind of a real soft spot for the whole sort of sovereign citizen type stuff back in the day. That's where I was. The other thing that had a really profound impact on me was my time in the Army Reserve. And I bring it up often, not because I'm trying to be like, ooh, look at me, I was in the army, but because it was a really profound period of time for me. The army is one of these institutions that in conservative circles is held up, venerated. It's almost a holy institution. And of course, you can't insult our troops, which I would tend to agree with, because again, just like those officers out the front of my house who were throwing me out, they were doing the wrong thing, but they believed themselves to be doing the right thing, and they had no way of knowing they weren't. And unfortunately, the same is largely true of soldiers. They often end up being involved in really horrible things that should never have happened, but not with evil intention. And I think intention matters. It doesn't matter in terms of judging what was done, but it does matter in terms of judging the individual and the character of the individual involved. So in conservative circles, the army is kind of this holy institution. You cannot question it. You cannot question any of the wars that we've ever been involved with. You can't, you certainly can't do that, especially not a war that good old Johnny Howard sent us into. You can't question that. And so I went into the army, and I went into the army for all the right idealistic, good conservative boy reasons. My thought process was basically, in this country, we have amazing freedoms that are a historical anomaly. And that was certainly true 30, 40 years ago. It is still true to a certain degree today. Let's not over dramatize. I mean, yeah, okay, all right. In the last 18 months, that's been really challenged. Um, but we enjoy an enormous gift that was given to us by previous generations, and they had to literally fight for that gift. And so I went into the army going, if I'm not willing to risk being in combat, and fighting to perpetuate those freedoms, then I'm not worthy of those freedoms in the first place. That was my thought process, a good conservative, young man thought process, right? And that was my thought process for going into the army. I went in there for all the right reasons, idealistic, thinking that I was going to be fighting for freedom and upholding what was right and good and just in the world. And that was why I signed on the dotted line. And I said, yep, okay, I'll be a soldier, only a reservist. I knew I never wanted to be a career soldier, but I was going to sign up to the reserves. I was going to do my time in the reserves. If anything happened globally and I ended up being deployed into combat, well, I was going to take that risk. I was willing to be joining on the spot if anything happened while I was in order to sort of pay my share of the price of what I'd been given. So, like I said, good conservative sort of thought process leading me to make that decision. But what happens when you're in something like the army and you're a conservative and you've venerated the army, you've almost given them this holy kind of status, and then you discover just how human they are. It's a little bit like seeing behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz, right? There's Oz, and then I see behind the curtain, there's just a little man, right? It was a little bit of that kind of experience and quite shocking um, to someone who, again, I cannot overemphasize. It's impossible for me to overemphasize how much of a good Christian conservative I was growing up. And then you see it, this almost deified entity of the armed forces, and you see behind that curtain, and it shocks you. And you realize that ultimately the decisions are being made by ordinary people who are flawed and make bad decisions for bad reasons and are selfish and proud, prideful, and all of the human failings. They're still there. We have this sort of idea, whether it's about politicians or about the armed forces or about the UN in the case of more left-wing politics. There's sort of this idea that these people have somehow ascended beyond that, and then you see the reality, and it's shocking. So these were the events, these were the things that then caused my conservatism to kind of crumble and caused me to go, okay, and I'm still very personally conservative in terms of the choices that I would make for myself and for my family, but I'm no longer politically conservative, and that's an important distinction to make. Politics is about what you would enforce on others. Personal is about what you would choose for yourself, and there's a very important distinction to be made there. Right, so I think as I look back and as I analyze it, I think I had this cognitive dissonance. I was a conservative, and yet I was also very alternative. I didn't go to a state school. I was homeschooled. I was into all this sovereign citizen sort of stuff, which is by definition challenging the sort of the status quo and challenging conservative ideas of government, etc. So I had this cognitive dissonance, these two things at once. So Lily has said, would I still consider myself somewhat Christian? Absolutely. Have a look at my last two slow chats to learn a lot more about that side of things. I'm not going to shove it down anyone's throat, but yes, absolutely. What year did I do Kapuka? 2001, I believe. I've still got the jumper that's got the date on it. It's 2001 or 2002. It was in that window of time where reservists and regulars did exactly the same recruit course, 7 weeks, exactly the same. They did that for only a couple of years, and then the regs, I think, became a 12-week course, and the reserves would still do 7 weeks and then do the rest of the training as part of their IETs later on in their unit. So it was 2001 or 2002, Heather. So that's where I came from, and I can understand why I was such a mess intellectually, because there's such a big dissonance between the homeschooling, sovereign citizen stuff on the one hand, and the good Christian conservative background on the other. And I couldn't make head nor tail of where I actually stood or what I actually believed on most things. I just reflexively sided with the Liberal Party and with good old Johnny Howard almost as a matter of religious observance, which, let's be honest, that's what politics has become. But those are the events, seeing behind the curtain in the army and then experiencing what I experienced there as my dad tried to take on the banks and tried to right a wrong. which has since been recognized as a wrong, but he couldn't get anywhere in the courts at the time. And those two processes are really what fractured me away from being a cookie cutter conservative. But even then, as I moved towards libertarianism and as I began to view government as more of a problem than a solution, we'll talk in detail about that in a minute, I still held, I would say I held very largely to a particular Winston Churchill quote, which I've actually looked up to get the wording exactly right. I've looked it up here and I've got it here. So this is Winston Churchill on the 11th of November, 1947. So this is a few years after the end of World War II. He says, "Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all of the other forms that have been tried from time to time." So that's been paraphrased by a lot of people and misattributed to Churchill. He's actually saying it has been said. So he's sort of quoting without attributing to other people before him. But this idea that democracy is the worst form of government known to man, with the exception of all of the others. And that was kind of my mantra for a very, very long time. It was this almost fatalistic or what can you do, pardon me, kind of idea of, well, it ain't good, it's broken, there's lots of things bad about it, but oh well, what can you do? And that's a very Australian kind of attitude. Oh well, you can't change it, so whatever. And I held that view for a very, very long time. I would say that it's a good, if somewhat jaded, conservative view, right? It ain't perfect, but it's the best we've got. But one by one, what happened through that period of time and after those events was my view of very specific policies that I had supported began to change radically. And I'll give you a few specific examples. These are some of John Howard's crowning achievements, things that he talks about to this day as having, as being sort of his legacy. The first time owners grant was one of the sort of crowning achievements. So not a crowning achievements, but one of the things that he trumpets as having been this really wonderful thing that he did to help young couples and young people afford to buy their own home. Well, the first time owners grant was basically the process of the government increasing demand for housing. Now, if house prices are too high, which is what he was saying at the time, then there's an imbalance between supply and demand. Demand is outstripping supply, right? So his solution is to then subsidize buyers, which is going to increase demand even further, right? His solution was literally to make the problem worse. Now, I didn't recognize that at the time. It took me years before I went, hang on, you can't fix a supply and demand imbalance by increasing the imbalance. That doesn't work. Is it any wonder that our house prices have continued to climb and have continued to get even further out of control and out of reach for people? Well, we can actually in part, only in part, but we can in part thank Johnny Howard and the first homeowners grant, which has persisted in some form or other pretty much ever since, for actually contributing to and helping to make that imbalance even worse. So this thing that I used to hold up as, hey, here's a great thing, great conservative thing, helping young people get their start. Well, one, it was unabashed socialism. And two, it actually made the problem worse. And we're going to see that's a theme. You're going to see a lot of this. I began to realize that the gun ban instituted after the 1996 Port Arthur massacre was actually not the right solution. Now, this is a little bit more nuanced, and there's a lot of conservatives that are still, on Johnny Howard's side about this one. But when you understand, if you've seen the video that I put up a couple of days ago, with me arguing with myself when COVID-19 and statism kind of bump into each other out the front of the Infectious Diseases Hall of Fame, I think I posted it 2 days ago or something, a little fun little video that I did. When you understand that government is the biggest man-made cause of death in the world. If you look at all causes of mortality, in terms of man-made causes of mortality, governments killing their own citizens by one means or another kills more people than wars, kills more people than any other man-made source of mortality. And when you get that perspective, you start to look a little bit differently on things like governments banning their citizens from owning guns. Now, this is a pretty controversial thing, and lots of people get really upset about it, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But my view of the gun ban when it happened was, yes, we need to get these off our streets. It's going to stop crime. It's going to be whatever, right? Now my view is the last thing you want to do is allow your government to take your guns. That's kind of become my view, and you're welcome to disagree with me on that. But that's again part of the evolution that I've gone on, and one of these good conservative policies that I completely disagree with now. I began to realize that border control is not actually moral. Again, if you're a conservative, you might find this a little bit offensive. But the idea that we can say to another human being, no, you're not allowed on this part of planet Earth because we were here first, in the context of private property, absolutely. In the context of governmental public property, no. No, it's completely absurd. It is completely immoral to be able to do that. Again, I'm not going to dive deep into that. This is getting into sort of specific libertarian philosophical points. That's not my focus tonight. But I'm simply letting you understand how much I've changed and how far I've come, for better or for worse. That's for you to decide. But this is how much I have changed. I began to realize, and this is the key point, I began to realize that conservatives and progressives actually have the same view of government. There is actually very, very little difference between them. And the view of government is that they are the solution. They're never the problem. They are the solution. Now, different sides of politics will argue about which areas they should get involved in and which problems they should be solving, but they agree that they are the solution. They agree that they know better than everybody else, and that they should get involved in whatever it is that they want to fix. They actually have the same view of government. Their view basically is that government has whatever power it wants, right? If they see a problem and they want to fix it, then they can give themselves whatever powers are necessary to fix it. Their view actually is that there aren't limits on their power. That's actually the government's view of its own situation. And we see this time and again with politicians running into limitations in the Constitution or in other laws and then looking for ways around it. They don't go, oh, I'm not given that power, therefore I better not do that thing. No. They go, oh, I can't get that power this way. Let me see if I can find another way to get that power. They believe in their own moral superiority, their own competence, and that they ought to be allowed to do whatever it is that they think is a good idea at the time. And all sides of politics agree on this point, that they have as much power as they deem necessary to do the thing that they believe is good. And I think if you need proof of that, look at what's happened with COVID-19. We have Liberal governments and Labor governments willing to trample all over human rights, willing to trample all over legal precedent, high court precedent, the Constitution itself, in order to do the thing that they deem necessary to protect the people, right? And so the government's attitude towards power is they have as much of it as they want. And no one is really allowed to tell them that they don't have that. The reality is that the major parties agree on far more than they disagree on. And we don't really have a choice. When we go to the voting booth, we don't really have a choice. Because the truth is, they're only this far apart. If the political spectrum was this long, our major political parties are only this far apart. And that's not a real choice in the context of what's actually out there. So, today I identify far more with a quote from J.R.R. Tolkien, also one of my favorite authors, but I've moved on from that Churchill quote, that democracy is the worst form of government ever invented with the exception of all of the others. I used to use that quote over and over again, not that it's an exact quote, but as a paraphrase. And I've moved on from that. So let me give you a quote that I identify with far more from J.R.R. Tolkien. The most improper job of any man, even saints, who at any rate are the least willing to take it on, is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity. Let me say that again because I stumbled. The most improper job of any man, even saints, is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity. That is very much my view now. That's kind of where I've arrived, is in agreement with that particular view. All right, so that's my journey. That's where I've been. That's where I've arrived at. All of that is to give the context to my view, my approach to the question tonight, which is, where do governments get their authority from? I've been on all sides of this. I've been on the pro-government authority side. There was a time when I would have been all gung-ho for the death penalty for drug dealers, right? Okay, I was a good little conservative. Those drugs, they're ravaging society. They're bad for people. They're blah, blah, blah. You know what? Anyone dealing drugs, let's just get rid of them so that we don't have to deal with this problem, deal with this scourge anymore. That's who I was. Today, I'm sitting here going, the government has no right to regulate drugs. Now, that doesn't mean I think they're good. I don't take them myself, with the exception of nicotine, caffeine, and alcohol. Those are my drugs, right? And I'm not interested in the other ones. I don't plan to take them ever, but I don't see how the government has the authority to be saying to you, hey, you grew and smoked or grew and sold that plant, or you mixed up these chemicals and sold them to somebody, therefore we're going to throw you in a cage. My progression has been quite extreme. I've seen these arguments from both sides. So now we get to the question for tonight. Where do governments get their authority from? It's a question that, honestly, many of us never asked, and I did not ask myself for the first 20 plus years of my life. The question never even floated through my menial, pitiful little brain. It just didn't occur to me. There's the government. They have authority. Of course they can do what they want to do. But why wouldn't they? They're the government. Well, the first thing I want to do is distinguish between authority and power. Authority is a legitimate power. It's a power that has its basis in something moral. There is a moral grounding for why they get to do that thing. Power is simply the ability to enforce or to do a thing, regardless of any moral basis. Regardless of whether it's right or wrong, or whether you actually have the authority to do that or not, if you have the power, you can still do it, and you can still get away with it. So, with that distinction in mind, where could authority come from? We're not talking about power. Like, if someone's got enough guns, then they can do whatever they want. They've got power, right? But we're not talking about that. We're talking about authority. We're talking about this idea that not only can they do those things, but they are right about doing those things, that they are right to do those things. Can you guys let me know if you're still, if I'm still coming through okay for you? Because I'm getting a warning that my internet is too slow. Can you just let me know if I'm breaking up or anything like that? For those that have asked since I started, this is a Rocky Patel age limited rare, second edition in the Robusto, one of my not absolute favorite, but it's among my favorite cigars. Okay, all good. Everyone's saying all good with the good. Okay. So where could authority come from? A moral grounding for a government or anyone to have any kind of authority. Well, it can be delegated by a higher authority. So a higher authority could delegate their powers to another entity, another person, another whatever. You know, the head of police, the police minister could delegate authority to someone to run a particular prison, and they get their authority from the police minister. But that doesn't answer where the highest authority gets their authority from. It doesn't answer the question. You've still got to figure out that all of that authority is being delegated from somewhere, from some higher authority. And ultimately you get to the top of that totem pole and you say, well, where did they get their authority from? Now, there is, of course, the argument that all authority comes from God, and that's in the Bible. You'll see that there, and a lot of Christians love to quote Romans 13 and various other passages of Scripture talking about how all authority comes from God, that governments are instituted by God, and they immediately draw the conclusion that therefore any Christian has to obey whatever the government says. And to our shame, and I say our because I am still a Christian to this day, Romans 13 was used by churches in Germany to tell German citizens to dob in Jews. Oh, well, the government's made a law that Jews have to identify themselves. If you know a Jewish person that hasn't gone and identified themselves and got their star on there, then you need to dob them in because they're doing the wrong thing. And Romans 13 says you've got to respect the civil authorities, etc. Okay? So there's this really shallow sort of view of this idea that God is in ultimate authority and then he delegates to others, and therefore it's what God wants, it's what we have to do. I want to address that for just a moment. I mean, obviously, um, people are not necessarily interested in the religious view there, Dennis. And fair enough. I'm not here to tell you what you need to believe, but I know that there are a lot of people that do wrestle with this. So let me touch on this for just a moment. If you look at the Apostle Paul, if you look at the Apostle Peter, these are the two guys that are quoted most often when it comes to this idea of you have to obey the government because governments are instituted by God. They themselves did not live according to that kind of strict definition of obedience. Their lives tell you that they didn't understand what they wrote in exactly that way, the way that we've interpreted it. Let's remember that what they wrote was written in Greek, ancient Greek specifically, and has been translated into English. And so the English translation isn't necessarily actually precisely accurate, and I would actually say is relatively inaccurate. If you want a deep dive into that, you need to go into my videos tab on my Topher page, scroll back a little while, and you'll see a video that I did called the politics of faith in Victoria when faith and politics collide as government takes the place of God. So the politics and faith in Victoria is the title of the video. Go back and watch that. The second half of that video, I dive into the theology a little bit around all of that stuff. So I'm not going to dwell on it now. But this idea that the government has authority because it was instituted by God and that's it, I'm sorry, but that is a very naive view of scripture and is not even borne out in the lives of the people that said those words. So you need to spend a bit of time researching that. Go back into my videos tab, scroll down a little bit. It's a couple of months old now. The politics of faith in Victoria. In the second half of that video, it's a talk that I did. It's about an hour and 10 minutes long. The second half of that is where I dive into that. So I'm not going to go deeper into that side of things. So there's the higher authority issue, but unless you're appealing to God and appealing to God's authority, you run into this problem. Where did the person at the top of the totem pole get their authority from in the first place? It doesn't actually solve the problem. So then you get another theory, and that theory is that authority comes from consent, from the consent of the governed. And this is a very, very common idea. It's one that you'll find expressed in the Federalist Papers. You'll find it expressed in the US Declaration of Independence. You'll find it expressed in English common law and various other documents throughout history, that authority comes from the consent of the governed. But that immediately raises a whole lot of really interesting questions. And this is where my brain went as I went through that process of watching my parents be evicted again, watching the exercise of power and seeing behind the curtain in the army and having all of my conservative sort of presuppositions really challenged. I then started asking myself, well, where does this consent thing work? How does this consent thing work? Because I don't feel like I've ever been given the option to not consent. I've never really been given any kind of choice in all of this. If their power comes from my consent, then surely it's only consent if I have the option to say no. And if I don't have the option to say no, how can you call that consent? So let me recap very briefly before I'm going to head to a toilet break, because I did promise a toilet break after some feedback from previous videos, and we're just about to go 9 o'clock. So governments reject the idea of a higher authority, the ultimate higher authority being God. Governments consider themselves to be the highest authority, and places that, or people that claim this higher authority, it was historically called the divine right of kings, right? Governments, kings, monarchs would claim that they ruled because God gave them the power to rule, and away they would go and make their rules and do whatever the hell they wanted with no respect whatsoever for God's law at all in any of that. That I'm putting aside for the purposes of tonight, because I don't think that's particularly relevant in the modern context. And if you do want to go deep, you can have a look at the other video that I just mentioned. So I'm going to be going a lot deeper into this question of consent right after I give all of you a chance to take a pee break, recharge your glass, grab another hot mug of tea or something like that. I am going to go and recharge my mug of tea, and I will be back at around about 2 or 3 minutes past 9, and I will see you then. Alrighty. I see that quite a lot of you have stayed, so thank you for that. I hope that that suffices for those that were asking for pee breaks and things from previous slow chats that I've done that have gone for 2.5 hours straight. I hope that that suffices and that you've been able to do whatever you need to do. I've got myself a recharge of tea. I am hoping my cigar hasn't gone out. Beautiful. Still very, very nicely lit. So we've arrived at the question of consent. And I deliberately made this the halfway point because this is really, from a modern perspective, this is what most people reflexively assume is the source of authority for government. So we've covered a whole bunch of my own sort of personal story, my own progression from a conservative now to being a libertarian, bordering on anarchist, flirting with the idea, but still processing it. And quite frankly, I don't really care because we're so far from even being libertarian that the question of whether we should be libertarian or anarchist is a completely useless argument to have. So I'm almost not even interested in that side of things. I'll get more interested as it actually becomes relevant. If we ever approach the point where any of that, pardon me, any of those questions are actually relevant, I'll pay more attention to that. But for now, I'm happy with. I'm a libertarian. But this question, this very modern idea that power for a government or authority for a government comes from the consent of the government. This is quite a modern idea. It certainly had its role historically speaking. It's not the modern era is not the first time that it's happened, but it's certainly the first time that it's been anywhere near as widely spread as what it is now. So, excuse me, consent. Consent is the main thing that most people assume is the source of a government's power. Social contract theory is probably the best known of all the consent-based arguments in favor of government power. And this was Thomas Hobbes way back in 1651, not a new idea at all. Positing this idea that there is this social contract that kind of binds the government to the governed and is what sort of guarantees that the government will serve the best interests of the governed and the government will go along with the laws made by the government and so forth. And there was a little while where I found this interesting and maybe even convincing, but I very quickly began to realize this so-called social contract doesn't fit the definition of a contract in any sense. If you tried to enforce it in a court of law, you would get laughed at and thrown out because the whole idea that there is this contract that where is it? Where's the contract I signed? Oh, it's the law. Okay. It's changing all the time. And I don't really get a say over how it changes. It gets applied inconsistently all the time. And I don't really get a say in how it gets applied. In fact, I'm supposedly now bound by this contract that was written before I was born. Now, if you're born into something and you are now a party to something before you were born, I'm pretty sure that's the definition of slavery. Right? I'm pretty sure, if you were the child of slaves and now you're automatically owned by whoever owned them, I'm pretty sure that's slavery, right? How am I bound by a contract that cannot be seen? I never had the opportunity to negotiate the terms of this contract. There is in consumer law, and I use this to great effect actually, back in the day when I was really flirting with a lot of this sovereign citizen stuff. I got a fine for overstaying my ticket in a privately owned car park, one of these care park things. And I was in there for about 15 minutes longer. I bought a ticket, right? It's privately owned, so I'm all about that. So I bought a ticket, I paid my money. I got back about 15 minutes late and they slapped me with a fine for $84. I remember it very well. And boy, was I was not $84 angry. I was $84,000 angry. I was so furious. And so I began to research and look at, okay, how do I fight this? How do I stick it to the man? Because that was the mode I was in with all the sovereign citizen stuff and everything else. That was the mode that I was in, stick it to it. So I researched consumer law. Not that I'm a huge fan of consumer law and a lot of these sorts of laws, but if it's useful to me in a particular fight, I'm going to use it. I'm going to use every weapon that's available to me. And I discovered that in consumer law, there's this thing called a standard form contract. Now, a standard form contract is any contract that you don't get the opportunity to negotiate the terms of. It simply applies if you X. If you drive into this car park, this is the contract that automatically applies to you. You don't get the chance to negotiate any of the terms of that. That is then considered under consumer law a standard form contract. And there are certain requirements around a balance between the rights and responsibilities of the parties who are party to a standard form contract. So I wrote a letter to Care Park and I basically said, your standard form contract is in breach of consumer law because it does not create a balance between the rights and responsibilities of the parties. Furthermore, and they were very careful, what they sent me, what they gave me was not called a fine, okay? What they gave me was a bill for liquidated damages. Now, that's a very important little technical point. Only government entities have the authority to fine. I would argue they don't even have the authority to fine. But under current law as it is practiced, if you're not a government entity, you don't have the ability to fine somebody. So a private car park does not have the ability to fine somebody for overstaying. So what they do instead is they call it liquidated damages. What they're saying is you've caused us $84 worth of harm, and so we're billing you for $84. And so I asked them to itemize the damage. Itemize the what went into the $84. I said $84 for 15 minutes of overstaying. I extrapolated that out over 24 hours. It was thousands upon thousands of dollars, and said, how did I cause you thousands of dollars worth of damage when your all-day parking is $50-something? I could park there all day for $50-something, but by staying for 15 minutes too long, I caused liquidated damages of $84. This is a fine by another name. And I found a court precedent out of West Australia where a private car park owner had actually gone to prison because they had called something a fine when they shouldn't have. And I said, look, if we go to court, I'm pretty sure the judges are going to realize that this is a fine by another name, and you could find yourself in the same position. Well, funnily enough, they withdrew the fine. Don't know why. But that was how combative I was in that phase of my life. I was ready just to absolutely fight anything. Right. So social contract. But I understood this concept of the standard form contract. If you don't get to negotiate the terms, then there has to be a balance between the rights and responsibilities of the parties under that contract under consumer law. Doesn't matter whether I like consumer law or not, that's what the requirement is. So I then looked at this so-called social contract, which has to be considered a standard form contract because I have no ability to negotiate the terms of this agreement. And I had to look at the rights and the responsibilities, and I had to look at the punishments that I am subject to if I breach my side of the contract, and the punishments that the government is subject to if they breach their side of the contract. And went, hang on, there's a real imbalance in the rights and the responsibilities of the parties here. So even if I accept that there is a social contract, it doesn't pass muster as an actual legitimate contract. I don't get to negotiate it. I never signed it. You won't find my signature on any of it anywhere. And it doesn't even pass basic consumer law requirements for a standard form contract in balancing the rights and responsibilities of the different parties. So I immediately ran into multiple problems as I tried to understand, where does government get its authority from? Oh, there's this theory of the social contract. I'm sorry, it doesn't hold up. Disclosure is vital to an enforceable contract. If someone signs a contract but you never disclosed the contract to them, then when you go to court, you won't be able to enforce that contract on them. If someone signs a contract and you start changing that contract on them, you're going to have a hard time enforcing that when it comes to a court of law. Now, of course, that happens all the time with software, right? Oh, we've updated our terms and services, blah, blah, blah. And that then comes under consumer law and a standard form contract and the balance of rights and responsibilities and everything else. And this so-called social contract doesn't pass muster on any of that. So it's not an enforceable contract. And in my opinion, social contract theory is completely worthless. It does not answer the question of where the authority of a government actually comes from. So we move on. There are some other theories. It comes from voting. We vote, therefore the government has authority. That immediately runs into some serious problems, especially in Australia. I'm forced to vote. Now, I actually chose not to vote. Again, back in that very combative era I chose not to vote at a local council election because I looked at all the candidates and they varied from socialist to Marxist. I was in the city of Darebin at the time, right? And for those of you that know Melbourne, you know the city of Darebin. My options on the ballot were between socialist and Marxist, and I could not in good conscience vote for anyone. So I chose not to show up and vote. I got a fine, $55, I think it was back then, for not voting in this election. And again, I went into fight mode. I was pissed. And so I wrote a letter back to them. And I quoted the Constitution, where the Constitution says that I can use my vote as I see fit. That's the terminology. As a person can use their vote as they see fit. And so I said, that has to include withholding my vote. You cannot tell me that I am able to use my vote as I see fit if you're going to force me to vote for somebody. That has to include the right to withhold that vote from anyone. And then just to cover off against the possibility that they might have turned around and said, but you still have to show up and get your name checked off the register. Because ultimately, if you vote informal, they can't punish you for that. They're punishing you because your name didn't get crossed off the register, right? And so just to cover off against that possibility, I went into Black's Law Dictionary. I think it was the 6th edition was the valid one at the time. And I got the definition of a farce. And a farce under Black's Law Dictionary is participating in the appearance of a thing without participating in the substance. And I found a High Court precedent that actually required, and I've got these letters somewhere, that basically said that no government entity could require someone to participate in a farce. And that was why I then looked up the word. And so I put all this into this letter. I said, requiring me to show up and get my name crossed off for the purpose of not voting is requiring me to participate in a farce, participate in the appearance of a thing without an effect on the substance of that thing. And you cannot tell me that I'm not allowed to withhold my vote. Surprise, surprise. They never took that fine any further either. That one just kind of disappeared. They never sent me a letter telling me they were withdrawing it. They just never followed up on it. So this whole idea that voting gives people a mandate, politicians love this idea of a mandate. Well, we got the majority of the votes, therefore we have a mandate. Hang on, how many people that voted for you actually read and understood your policies? Not a lot. Politics is a tribal game. We vote for our tribe. We don't actually really necessarily understand many, if any, of their actual policies. And how can you turn around and say that you have a mandate for a specific thing based on the votes of people? And what about politicians under our system that get in on preferences? Right? They didn't actually get a mandate. They didn't actually get a majority of votes. They got in on preferences. So the whole thing, this idea that their authority comes because we voted, falls apart very, very, very quickly as soon as you begin to actually ask simple questions about it. So then we get to the next one that a lot of people rely on. That authority, a government's authority, comes from the Constitution. Again, it's another one of those ones that sounds good until you actually stop and think about it. How is the Constitution different to the social contract? Here is a document that was signed by people that were long dead before I was born that somehow binds me, that somehow I'm now a party to this thing that was written by other people at another time that may or may not have had my best interests at heart, that I get no say in. I can't change in any meaningful way. And all of a sudden I'm bound by it. We hit all of the same problems that we hit with this whole sort of social contract issue. Now, what all of these things do, whether it's social contract, whether it's voting, whether it's constitution, what they all do is they're all various forms of delegation of authority. They're all various forms of saying there was this authority that got delegated, right? The people had authority and they voted, therefore they delegated authority to the government. They gave the government a mandate. Or there's this thing called a social contract, and we have the authority to do these things on behalf of the people because they're a party to the social contract. It's all about this delegation of authority. It's this idea that they derive their power from the people. And that, again, sounds good. The consent of the governed. Like it shows up in the Federalist Papers in the US. It shows up in the US Declaration of Independence. It shows up again in various concepts of English common law. This idea that we derive power from the consent of the governed, which sounds great. But here's the fundamental problem that every single one of these ideas runs into. We cannot delegate authority that we do not have. I'm going to say that again. We cannot delegate to others authority that we do not have. If the government is deriving its authority from the consent of the governed, from the delegation of authority from the people, it cannot have power that the people do not individually already have. Because where did that come from? If you cannot delegate power that you don't have, the government cannot have power that we do not individually already have, because we're delegating it individually, right? Even if we accept the social contract or accept the voting argument or accept any of these arguments, if we are basing the government's authority on a delegation of power, we run straight into this problem. People can only delegate to the government the power that they individually have. And that breaks the entire idea of the delegation of authority. So think about this. I do not have the right to take some of my neighbor's income, right? If I tried to do that, I'd go to prison. I'd be a criminal, and rightly so. I don't have the right to do that. Does that give, how can I delegate to the government the right to take some of my neighbor's income? I can't. I don't have that power in the first place. And if I can only delegate the power that I have, where does that leave us in terms of where the government gets its power from? It cannot be from delegation, because the government's doing all kinds of things that I don't have the authority to do. You don't have the authority to do. If we did these things, we would be criminals, and rightly so. And yet the government is doing them every single day. And we all sit here and go, yeah, that's fine. That's exactly how it should be. Now, Danny has made the point, if I can see my mouse again, power is given to the government by the majority, not the individual. I would argue that that is actually a misunderstanding of how governments get delegated, or how power gets delegated to governments. Because the very next point that I have in my notes is that majorities do not matter. If me and every other person on the street got together and we held a vote about my neighbor's income, and now we all agreed there's an overwhelming majority on the street that our neighbor should give us a bunch of their money, it doesn't change the reality that we don't have the power to do that. If we don't have the power to do it individually, we do not have the power to do it collectively. Majorities do not matter. There is a quote that I should have looked up and gotten you a source for, but basically saying, if someone has a right, then it is theirs against the whole world. They could be alone, a single individual, against every other person on the planet. But if it is their right, then it is their right. And they hold that regardless. Majorities are actually irrelevant. And that's really uncomfortable when you live in a democracy where everything's decided by majority. The realization that actually the entire foundation of government legitimacy in the country where you live is actually not legitimate is incredibly uncomfortable. This is the conclusion that I came to. Any government claiming authority above what your neighbor has is not operating in authority, it's operating in power. Now, you remember we talked about the distinction. The authority is a legitimate and morally based authority to operate within a certain sphere. Power is simply the exercise of power. I have the guns, I have the manpower to make you do what I want. Doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. I came, and I arrived at this a number of years ago, to the very uncomfortable conclusion that the Australian government, the Victorian government, the New South Wales government, the UK government, the US government are not operating in authority. They're operating in power. And that is a very uncomfortable conclusion. It's not one that I like, but it's the one that I inevitably came to as I actually asked myself these questions. What's even more uncomfortable is that the world starts to make a lot more sense once you begin to see it through that particular lens. Everyone agrees. Let me give you this example. Everyone agrees that government's power is not unlimited, right? Everyone agrees that there are limits on a government's power. And if anyone tries to say otherwise, hit him with Godwin's law, right? Lose the argument with Godwin's law, but win the argument because you're making a point. Did Hitler have the legitimate moral and lawful authority to execute Jewish people? No, he did not. I think it would be pretty universally agreed, except maybe by Holocaust deniers, that Hitler did not have that authority. It was not a legitimate moral authority that he was exercising. He was simply exercising raw power. So I'm going to say, for the purposes of the discussion, it is universally agreed that governments do not have all power. There are limits on their power. To that end, we've tried all kinds of different ways of limiting that power over the centuries. We've tried things like constitutions and constitutional monarchies, as well as constitutional republics like the US. We've tried the separation of powers, again, the US being a prime example of that, but even within the Westminster system, the separation of powers, the judiciary will operate over here, the legislative will operate over here, the executive, the crown will operate over here. And there's meant to be these separations of powers that's meant to sort of balance and keep people from taking too much power to themselves. So we've seen that as well. We've seen bills of rights. The US, again, being a prime example of this, they have their amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution. Excuse me a second. This is trying to go out on me. All of those have been different attempts, different methods of trying to impose or trying to enforce this idea that a government's power is not unlimited. Mankind knows this. This is not actually a controversial thing. And we've tried all these different ways of limiting the power of government. But as we look around the world today, I want to ask you the question, is it working? Look around the world today. Are limits on government power imposed through bills of rights, imposed through the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, imposed through the Westminster system, imposed through constitutions, are these limits actually working? Come on, little guy, don't go out on me now. I'm just going to have to touch it up a little bit with my lighter. There it is. If you neglect a cigar for too long, then some of the wrap will start to go out. That changes the flavor quite dramatically in ways that aren't necessarily nice. So it's good to kind of touch it up and get it burning a bit more complete before it all goes horribly, horribly wrong. We've tried all these things. Constitutional republics, constitutional monarchies, Westminster system, bills of rights, human rights charters, signing up to UN stuff, whatever. We've tried all kinds of different things. But I think the lesson from COVID is that none of them are working. That actually right around the world, governments are operating in much the way that I expressed early on, with the view that they have the power, the authority, they have the power, especially in Australia because we're all disarmed, but they have the authority in the minds of the politicians to do whatever they deem necessary for the public good. If so long as they can say it's for your own good, then they can do whatever the hell they want. And I would hope that 16 months into the whole COVID situation here in Australia, that would be a fairly self-evident thing to say. I want to put to you a fairly challenging conclusion, and it is my expectation that I'm going to lose a bunch of followers on Facebook and blah, blah, blah out of this. But hopefully those of you that have been with me for a while, you understand that that's not really what I'm about, the number of followers and all the rest of it. So I'm more interested in standing up for what I believe to be right. And if that means that from time to time I upset a bunch of people and they leave, well, so be it. So here we go. Government as it exists today, in order to properly understand it, you need to look at the Mafia. Like I said, that's going to piss a lot of people off. But to actually properly understand the way government functions today, you need to look at the Mafia. They have power because they claim it and they defend it to the death. And they have people that will enforce it on their behalf over you, whether you like it or not. Whether or not they're actually right is no longer relevant. And we see that today in Victoria especially, but it's happening around Australia. It's happening federally as well with Scott Morrison. The question of whether what they're doing is actually right is no longer a question that they care about. They're only asking whether they can do it. Who cares whether it's right? Who cares whether lockdowns are in agreement with the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities? Daniel Andrews does it anyway. Who cares that the Victorian Ombudsman has found him to be in breach of the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities? It doesn't matter. You don't understand. We're saving lives here. We're doing whatever. I can do whatever I deem necessary. That's the position. Daniel Andrews, Scott Morrison, Gladys Berejiklian, and the whole lot. That is the position that all of them hold when it comes to their own power. Now, the common retort when I make this analogy between government and mafia is they say, no, it's nothing like the mafia. The government does lots of good things for us. Yes, they take our taxes and all the rest of it, but they build schools and they build hospitals and they build roads. What would we do without the roads? If that's your answer, if that's your instinctive reply, I would suggest you don't know very much about the mafia. Because the mafia in Italy, South America, and Russia, other parts of the world, when they take over a town, guess what? They run schools. They do. They run welfare programs. They have soup kitchens. They do all kinds of things to help the poor. And this blew my mind when I discovered this, 15 plus years ago. Blew my mind because I always thought that the mafia was like what you saw in the movies, right? It was the mob. It was all about their own little empire that they were building. And yes, it is. But once they're in power, once they take over a town, they know that they need to keep that town. And if they're going to keep that town, they've got to look after the people in it. So what do? They meet their needs. Now, think about the kinds of places where mafia takes over a town. It's usually where government is quite dysfunctional, where there's a bit of a power vacuum, and they're able to move in. And take South America, take Brazil. Brazil's a classic case where organized crime took over entire neighborhoods, funded usually by drug money. But they ran schools and they ran soup kitchens. And they even actually, to a certain degree, got involved in medical care and health care, looking after the people on their turf. Why? Because the people sat there and went, you know what? We're better off under this organized crime gang than we were under the government. The government ignored us. At least these guys are actually doing something for us. They bought votes. Now, there was no election. There was no formal voting process, but they bought the hearts and minds of the people that they were ruling over by simply handing out little bits of little scraps here and there. Now, what completes this analogy is then they used the schools as recruiting grounds. Where did they get their next generation of foot soldiers, of enforcers? Well, they brought them up in the schools. They taught them what they needed to know only to support the gang, to support the crime boss. And they became fertile breeding grounds from which they could recruit the next generation of enforcers, the next generation of foot soldiers, the next generation of drug mules. But isn't that exactly what governments do? Isn't that exactly what state-run education is? Isn't that exactly what happens when you see a TV ad for recruiting for the army, recruiting for the police force? Isn't that our government literally recruiting its own enforcers to maintain the status quo, to maintain their power within the jurisdiction that they have managed to carve out for themselves from the population that they are now looking after? The deeper you look, the more disturbingly accurate the analogy between organized crime and government is. One of my favorite cartoons that I've posted to my page before is a kid walking up to his dad. His dad is reading the newspaper, and the kid says to the dad, "Dad, I've decided I want a career in organized crime." And the dad's reply is to say to the kid, government or private sector, right? And that was funny the first time I read it. Now it kind of hurts. Now that I've sort of seen a lot more about the world and how it works, and I've certainly changed my views on what government is and how it works. It's painfully true. Government or private sector? Which area of organized crime do you want to work in? Now, the people working in government, they're not mobsters, right? This is a really important distinction to draw, because a lot of people choke on this point. They go, but I know police officers and they're good people. Yep, so do I. I've got police officers in my family and they are good people. And they do what they do for the right reasons, for the noblest of reasons. But understand, the sheriffs that were there kicking my family out of their home with no idea what the court case was about, no understanding that actually history has proven my dad right, but he never got his home back. That they were actually operating in a protection racket for the banks and for the unlawful activity of the banks at the time. They just didn't know it. They were good people too, right? I'm not sitting here saying they were evil. They never signed up thinking that they were going to be enforcing injustice, but that is where they ended up. So the good people argument, I'm sorry, it doesn't pass muster. It doesn't actually matter. Yes, they're good people, and that's important when we look at them individually and we judge their character. But when you actually step back and look at the machine as a whole, it's irrelevant. The motives of the people working within that system are irrelevant. The outcomes of that system is what actually matters. So, in summary, I have absolutely no say in what the government demand of me. But if I don't comply, I get punished. If I choose not to comply for long enough, that punishment becomes violent. It stops being letters in the letterbox and it starts being police officers at the door. It starts being arrest warrants and dragged away. Stood up in front of some guy in a wig and a gown and being told that you've been a very naughty boy. According to who? Well, according to the government that may or may not have been operating in legitimate authority in the first place. That's irrelevant now. The fact is they have the power, and that's what actually matters. And if you're sitting there going, this is uncomfortable, I don't like this. This almost sounds dangerous, right? I agree. It's very uncomfortable. I've been in a very uncomfortable place ever since I came to this conclusion that I essentially live under a variation of the mafia. Their motives are different. Their intent is different. But in practical terms, there's not a meaningful difference. If I lived in a mafia town and I was running a coffee shop and their standover man came in for their protection racket money, guess what? He'd get his money. Just the same as the tax man. He gets his money. Right? I don't play games with my taxes. I don't need that kind of stress in my life. I pay the money. I claim all the deductions that I can lawfully claim, and then I pay the money. Why? Because I don't want the men at my door with the guns dragging me away to get punished. Exactly the same as why a cafe owner pays the protection racket the money to keep the mafia off his back, to keep the mob off his back. In practical terms, I don't believe anymore that there is actually a meaningful difference. So, that's a very disturbing conclusion to draw. I'm not going to leave the video there or leave tonight's chat there. What I'm going to do, I'm going to finish up with what do we do about it? What can we actually do to make a difference and to actually, Adam Gary says, do the ATO really come with guns? All law is enforced at the barrel of a gun. That's the reality. Now, it's not enforced the first time at the barrel of a gun, but they will use whatever level of force is necessary to ultimately get your compliance. And if you remain non-compliant for long enough, eventually, yes, it ends up at that point. Yes, they do. They do. They'll come to your door to enforce. Sorry, that's the one I meant for. I meant to be putting up to do the ATO really come with guns? They don't. They get a warrant, and then the sheriffs show up with guns, right? And it's due process. You had your day in court. A guy with a wig and a gown said that you were a naughty boy. We're just enforcing what the court said. You're in contempt of court. You're in whatever. Okay, they have their system. The system is in place, but just because there's a system doesn't mean that it's just. It doesn't mean that the outcomes are actually good or moral or lawful. Glenn is saying that I'm pixelating again. I'm sorry about that. I am getting a warning that my internet is poor at the moment. I have to assume that that's because we're in lockdown and everyone around me is streaming Netflix and whatever else. So I do apologize. Hopefully the audio remains okay and you can hear me all right. So let me get to the last little bit that I've got for today, and then I look forward to having a chat with you guys and hanging out for a bit longer, and you can ask me questions and I'll answer the ones that I think I have anything meaningful to say on. What do you do about it? Right now, this might be a conclusion. You might have arrived at the same conclusion that I've arrived at. Craig Lotter is saying, it's a better look. Thanks, mate. I appreciate that. I've got a great face for radio. I've always known that. So what do you do? Now, I'm not saying you have to agree with me. I'm not even necessarily saying I'm right. I'm saying that this is where I've come to. What do you do about it? If you happen to agree, if you happen to think that maybe there's some merit in what I'm saying, what do you do about it? Well, some people try and change the system from the inside. They'll get into politics. And I get asked regularly by various people and occasionally by actual parties in a formal manner asking me to run for politics. And I have a fairly glib response that is a cop-out. I'll acknowledge before I even say it, it's a cop-out. My response is to say that I'm hoping to do something meaningful with my life, and that rules out politics. And there's a smidgen of truth to that. I'm fascinated by business. I enjoy business. I'm interested by business, and I think business brings a huge amount of value to humanity. Entrepreneurship. I'm not a particularly successful entrepreneur, but I'm learning, and I intend to become one before I die. And that's where my ambitions kind of lie. Does that mean I'll never be in politics? I can't say never. You can never say never. We're certainly in an interesting moment in time where, I don't know, maybe there's an argument to be made that I don't know. That's beside the point. People go in and they try and change the system from within. And I've seen people do that, and good people do that. With only a handful of exceptions, they don't change the system changes them. The honest reality of the whole, I'm going to go in, I'm going to sign up for whatever party, I'm going to change it from within, and I'm going to blah, blah, blah. The reality is party politics and the system as it exists within the parties is designed to keep people like that away from any meaningful position of power. The parties like the status quo. They like it the way it is. Especially Labor, Liberal, and Nationals. They love it. They've got a lovely, cozy thing going where they hand power from one to the other from time to time. They don't really care about being in opposition for a while because sooner or later they'll get back in. And they don't really mind when the other side takes more power for the government. This is important. The Liberals don't mind when Daniel Andrews in Victoria, so the Liberals are in opposition, Daniel Andrews is Labor. They don't mind when Daniel Andrews runs out and grabs a whole bunch more power for himself, because they know that when they get to sit in the big chair at some point in the future, all those powers will now belong to them, and they'll be able to play with them. And vice versa. The Liberals get in and they focus on different areas, but they never wind back what the other side did, right? They never give back the power that the other side took. One side goes, right, we care about these things, we're going to take these powers. The other side will grumble about it in opposition because they have to, they're in opposition. And then when they get into the big chair, they keep those powers, but now they go, well, we really care about this. And they go and take some more power over here. And that's been the progression that we've had in Australia since Federation and since before Federation. And that's how we end up with a situation where we've got more laws than any human being can possibly know. You know, this always amazes me. We're in this situation where legally ignorance of the law is no excuse under the law. You cannot stand up in court and say, Your Honor, I didn't know. I didn't know that the law required me to do that. That's not a defense. And yet there are more laws than any one human being can possibly know. Now, that has got to be the shortest and simplest argument for how immoral our system has become. There are more laws than you can possibly know, but not knowing them is not a defense. Right, so I think a good start would be to contract the amount of laws down to what one adult could reasonably know all at the one time. That would be a good starting point. So people go into politics wanting to change the system. Unfortunately, more often than not, the system changes them. There are some exceptions. Some people have held their values in politics. I'm yet to see any of them have a big impact. I'm very grateful for the impact that they do have. I'm not criticizing them at all. They're doing everything that they can, but there is a very limited amount that anyone can do within the system. A politician, someone getting involved in politics to try and change it from within, can potentially change the policies, but they can't change the system. Unless you got to be the prime minister. But how do you get to be the prime minister? Well, it's a popularity contest amongst the other politicians. How are you going to win that popularity contest if your promise is to dramatically reduce how much power the other politicians get? You're not going to win that fight. You're not going to win that popularity contest among your peers, among the other politicians. So the only way you can sort of win inside the game of politics is to win in this fake conservative versus progressive sense, right? Oh, we got to win. We passed this piece of legislation that's conservative or that's progressive or whatever. And people spend their whole lives fighting over this, but missing the bigger picture. That every time they're fighting, they're writing new laws, they're making more regulations, they're increasing the power of government every single time. So the reality is that the growth of government is inevitable, right? Because both sides of politics want more power. That's actually what they want. Understand, politicians and the political parties have more in common with each other than they have with you. They sit down and they're chummy. They have meals together, they smoke cigars together, they do social things together. Sure, they play the game in front of the cameras and they do all the catty backbiting and opposition stuff and blah, blah, blah. And they really do a good job of looking like opposing teams. But ultimately, they have a lot more in common with each other than they have with you. So the growth of government is inevitable because of just the whole dynamic of how it works. Think of the foxes basically guarding the hen house. We've now got to the point where the only thing restraining the size of government is the government. The government takes whatever power it wants. They take whatever power they deem necessary in their own opinion. That is literally like having the foxes guarding the hen house. The government is not going to reduce its own power. And there is never going to be a point where politicians get together and go, you know what? We've gone too far. We've written too many laws. Or even, you know what? We've reached we've reached perfection. We've written enough laws. There's no more laws necessary. That day will never come. There's always going to be another problem to solve, another crisis to address, another thing that needs to be fixed by the power of government. So the growth is never going to stop. Another analogy that I quite like is sheep on a farm spend their life afraid of the foxes and grateful that the sheepdog and the shepherd protect them. But then in the end, they get eaten by the shepherd. Right. And that's unfortunately where we've actually gotten to in politics. So I've thought long and hard about this. What do I do? I'm going to tell the story that I've told a few times recently, so I apologize if you've heard this before, but this is very, very important. My wife and I were in Venezuela in 2015. We were in Caracas for a week for a friend's wedding. If you know the story of Venezuela, you'll know that things are pretty bad there. Their government is well and truly out of control. Poverty is, they went from being in the top 10 richest countries in the world to now being barely above North Korea. They are an absolute basket case. We were there in 2015 at a moment in history. They're not anymore, but at a moment in history when Caracas was the most dangerous city in the world outside of a war zone. We knew that at the time going in, and we were looked after really well. The groom, who was Venezuelan, had one of his best buddies basically chaperone us the whole time we were in the city, and it was actually a really wonderful trip. But looking around, you could really see the effect of bad government. You could see how wealthy they used to be. You could see the buildings and the architecture built in the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1960s. And you're like, wow, this place had money. And they did. And then you drop your eyes from all the architecture up there down to street level, and there's a line going around 3 or 4 blocks of people trying to get in, waiting to get into a supermarket. And the supermarket shelves are empty. There's nothing there for them. But there came a really pivotal moment for me that has haunted me ever since. And it was the moment when we were sitting in a jazz bar. The culture there is incredible. The music culture, the food culture is really incredible. It's actually like, if it wasn't for the fact that they're a socialist hellhole, I could have a lot of fun in Venezuela. I could really enjoy myself in Caracas. And we were sitting in a jazz bar, amazing jazz musicians playing, drinking massive cocktails the size of a fishbowl that cost us about $1.70 each. We figured out the exchange rate. It's about $1.70 for like a massive thing. And they were strong, like they were properly alcoholic. My wife and I were sitting there having a great time. And I ended up having a chat with a guy who was at the next table over from us, an older Venezuelan gentleman. And we got talking, and he began to share with me. He quickly sort of figured out not who I am in terms of Topher and blah, 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 but that I'm from Australia and I'm not a socialist. I'm not a communist. And he began to share with me his pain, because he was one of the people that knew, he was old enough to remember when Venezuela was incredibly prosperous, incredibly wealthy. And when Hugo Chavez, and even before Hugo Chavez, but it really went downhill from Hugo Chavez on, was trying to win the election, this man campaigned against Hugo Chavez. He joined the protests. He joined political parties. He did all the things to try and stop that from happening. But what he didn't do, in his own words, was he didn't make a plan for what he would do to protect his family if they lost. If things didn't go to plan, the socialists won, and the country went downhill in exactly the way that it did, he never made a plan for that. He never made a plan for the family to be able to get out. And what I will never forget is the look on his face as he tried to express to me what it was like growing old with the knowledge, or growing old watching his son, who is now an adult, struggling to survive, watching his grandson suffering the effects of malnutrition, suffering under this government that they had, knowing that he saw it coming, knowing that he had a window of opportunity in which he could have made a plan, in which he could have, like so many others did, got his family out to the US or to Brazil or to Chile or Nicaragua or anywhere, but didn't. And that's haunted me ever since. What is it now? We're in 2000, so it's 6 years. That conversation has haunted me ever since. And so my conclusion is not necessarily yours, and I'm not saying it's the right one or a good one or whatever. It's just my conclusion. My approach to this problem that we have in this country is that I need a plan B. I am never going to be that man. I am not going to grow old watching that happen to my kids, to my grandkids, knowing that I saw it coming and I never did anything about it. So my choice is to opt out. And there's a whole political philosophy here. It's sort of the opting out political philosophy, which I'm going to go deeply into, but I'm going to cover in sort of fairly broad brushstrokes. One of the comical things, one of the common things that is said to people when someone like myself, when I say, hey, I'm a libertarian, people go, oh, you don't want government, move to Somalia then. Okay. Sure. I'm not going to choose Somalia. I'm an adult. I can choose wherever I want to go. But if your answer to me is, if you don't like the government, then leave. Okay. That's a viable option. Now, I'm not heading for the door this instant, but I'm putting in place a plan so that in the event that I make the decision that it's time to get the family out, I need things already in place. It's too late at that point to be putting things in place. There are people who waited too long to get out of Cuba, people who waited too long to get out of Venezuela, people who waited too long to get out of Zimbabwe, people who are waiting too long right now to get out of South Africa. I don't want to be that guy. There's some interesting things around this, and I mentioned this in a previous slow chat, but I'll mention him again. There's a guy called Andrew Henderson. He runs a website called The Nomad Capitalist. I think it's nomadcapitalist.com. I highly recommend you spend some time there, because Lorraine has asked the perfect question. Thank you, Lorraine. You couldn't have scripted that better. Where would you go? That's the question that I get asked when I talk about this. Where would you go? And the first thing I would say, Lorraine, and to everybody, is don't think of it like right now, all of your life. Okay, I don't know about your circumstances. You might have immigrated. You might have your life already spread over multiple countries. You might have multiple passports. All of my life is in Australia. I was born here. I've lived here most of my life. I've traveled a bit, but I've lived here most of my life. I have an Australian passport. All of my bank accounts are in Australia. My businesses are in Australia. Everything's in Australia. Everything I own, everything I have is in Australia. Now, there's this concept that is recognized in global investment circles called sovereign risk. So if you are a global hedge fund or a global investor, and you're saying, right, are we going to fund a new mine in Australia, or are we going to fund a new mine in Namibia, right? One of the many things that they will take into account is which country has the lowest sovereign risk, which country is the least likely to go and expropriating privately owned property? Which country is not going to steal our mine? We drop a couple of $1 billion into a mine. Where is the sovereign risk the lowest? Now, that's a well understood concept in sort of global investing terms, but I think this is a concept that we need to start thinking about in terms of our own individual lives. Sovereign risk. When you look at Australia, when you look at the decisions being made, when you look at the direction we're going in, what's being done right now politically, when you consider, for example, the fact that more than half of Australian families are now dependent on government money. Sorry, not families. More than half of Australian households are now dependent on government money to make ends meet. When you comprehend that in a democratic system, how does a politician, how does a political party gain power if they're promising to reduce welfare? They can't. More than half of Australian households are depending on that welfare to make ends meet. It's my opinion, and I hope to be proved wrong, and I'm going to keep fighting tooth and nail. I'm not running out the door and leaving you all, and leaving the country behind and whatever. I'm going to keep fighting because I'm an optimist, and I hope that this can be turned around. But it's very hard to see how it can be turned around when politically it's just not even possible. When more than half of Australian households need that government money, need that welfare money, how do you turn that around politically? How is it possible to get voted in promising to reduce welfare, reduce spending, get the budget balanced, reduce red tape, reduce green tape, be business friendly, etc.? That doesn't get up. Those policies don't get voted for in a world and in a country where you've got that dynamic playing out in the background. So, where would you go? Lorraine, don't think of it as taking your entire life out of this country and placing your entire life into another country, because then you're exposed to exactly the same sovereign risk. You've got now you have to watch this new country like a hawk. Where's it going? What's it doing? How, are they going to go down the same path? What I would really encourage you and everybody else to do is to spend some time on nomadcapitalist.com. There's no affiliation. I don't get any money out of this. I've been following this guy for about 4 years, and I'm now putting into practice some of the things that I've learned through him. Nomadcapitalist.com. And particularly use this search bar and search for flag theory. Flag theory. So FLAG, literally like a flag, right? And what he talks about and what he has done and has helped many other people to do is to plant flags in different countries. So you don't necessarily have to live in the same country where you have the passport. You can have an Australian passport and be living as a resident in another country. There's lots of passports that give you an enormous ability to just simply show up to other countries and say, hey, I would like to live here for a while. And they just stamp your passport and go, hey, come on in, welcome. We're happy to have you. So where you live is not where you have your passport. And it's not necessarily where you have your business set up and registered. And it's not necessarily where you own your investments. You might be investing in other cities, in other countries outside of where you live. That isn't where you have your passport or where you live or where you have your business registered. And so you're actually spreading yourself, and planting flags is what he calls it. You're spreading yourself across multiple jurisdictions. What that means is that when one of those jurisdictions starts to head in a direction that you're not happy with, it's a lot easier for you to extricate yourself from that jurisdiction. If it's the one where you're living, you just simply go to another country where you've got automatic residence. If it's the one where you've got your business registered, you can move the business registration. You can set up a business in another country, move the assets across. It's relatively easy for you to make that next move. I would encourage you to think less of governments as a place where you plant your entire life, and more, think of them more like shopping malls. Okay, a government is basically a glorified shopping mall. And let me explain that. If you are a storeholder in a shopping mall, you pay your lease, you pay your rent to be in that particular shopping mall. And in return, that shopping mall provides you with a whole bunch of things. Things that, funnily enough, a lot of people think only a government can provide. But actually, we've got plenty of examples all over Australia of the private sector providing exactly those things. A shopping mall provides roads. They provide parking. They provide cleaning. They provide toilets. Many of them provide playgrounds for kids, public areas, art, public art in common spaces. They provide security. They provide all the things that a state supposedly, if we didn't have the government, we couldn't possibly have any of these things. Well, actually, we've got lots of examples all over Australia and all over the world of all of these things being provided by the private sector. Now, if you owned a chain of stores, well, okay, if you owned one store and you were in a shopping center, I'm not going to name one because it'd be off the top of my head and I don't want to get myself sued for jolly slandering somebody, but you've got one store in a shopping mall, and if that shopping mall goes downhill, they make some bad decisions, they do some bad marketing, they get some bad press, that whatever happens, and that shopping mall starts to go downhill, the foot traffic isn't the same, now you're losing money, you've got a big problem, right? You've got to uproot your business from that one location and find another one location to stick it in. But if you've got multiple stores across multiple locations, the pain of moving out of one bad jurisdiction is far lower than if everything is in one bad jurisdiction. So that's the mindset that I would encourage you to have as you think about this stuff. It's not a case of I'm going to take my entire life out of one and into another. It's a case of I'm going to take my entire life out of one and I'm going to spread it across. And Andrew Henderson's slogan is "Go where you're treated best." So that's the nomad capitalist that I've mentioned. Go where you're treated best, and it really resonates with me. And I think it's a very good libertarian / anarchist kind of philosophy. It comes back to, if you're into all the nerdy stuff, it kind of comes back to Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged and all that sort of stuff of simply saying I am not being treated well here, and I'm just going to opt out. I'm just going to step out. And just go, you know what, if you're not going to treat me the way that I actually expect to be treated, and I think as a human being I deserve to be treated, then I'm going to go and find somebody that's going to treat me better. Now, again, I'm not running for the door. I'm in Australia. I have no plans to leave Australia yet, but I'm putting in place the mechanisms necessary so that if I have to get out for the sake of my family, so that I don't become that old guy that I was talking to in Caracas, if that day ever comes, I've already got everything in place, and it's not a huge and traumatic thing for me to do. But there's another part to it as well, which is really interesting. And again, this isn't going to make me very many friends. We all pay tax, right? You earn money, you pay tax. It's what is it? It's the price of living. It's the price you pay for living in a civilized country. Well, I would dispute that, but that's the opinion of many people. But every transaction can be viewed in two different ways. So when you pay your tax, right? So the Australian government, let's say you've got two people working in your household and you're both median Australian salary earners. Now, I know because of the research that I did for a video that I released in 2012 that the tax burden in Australia is actually more than 50% for a median Australian salary earner. Now, that's income tax, GST, plus all the other little taxes and fees and registrations and government kind of money that you have to pay out just to be able to live. It's actually in excess of 50%. So if you've got two people earning, I don't know what the median salary is anymore, but let's say 75 grand, it's 150 grand. In the end, you're paying $75,000 a year for the privilege of living in Australia. The cost of your government is $75,000 a year. And if you start to view them not like a government and more like a shopping center, more like the management of the shopping center where you happen to be set up right now, it becomes easier to start to ask yourself, well, what am I getting for my $75,000? What am I getting in return for the amount of money that I'm being forced, whether I like it or not, to pay into this particular jurisdiction? And there's a flip side to that equation. So that the Australian government is saying to that hypothetical family, they're saying, you need to pay us $75,000 in order to live here through all the different taxes and costs and everything else. You need to pay us $75,000 to live here. Well, there's a flip side to that exact equation, and that is they will pay you $75,000 to leave. Right? It's exactly the same equation. But if they're taking $75,000 from you for the privilege of living here, then you'll be $75,000 better off if you don't. Now, that obviously assumes that your income is not location dependent. If you have to show up to a physical location to do your job and it's not something you could do in another place, well, it's a different equation. And one of the things my family have been working on, and my wife and I are working very hard on right now, is location independent income, getting to the point where we can earn our money no matter where we are in the world. Now, not everyone can do that. I recognize that. But for those that can, for those that have a skill set or a profession or what have you that can be done on a laptop, on a computer, this idea of location independent income, once you have that, you then really have to ask yourself, if the government is offering me $75,000 a year to live somewhere else, maybe I should take them up on that offer, right? maybe I should actually, if that's their deal, maybe I'll take that deal, right? Now, a lot of people say, well, I can't. Okay, I have a job, I have kids in school, I've got family here, I've got whatever. Well, I've got, well, I don't have kids in school. My oldest is not yet in school, but or I'm homeschooling him at home at the moment. He's 5, but we've got family here. All my family is here, apart from one brother who's moved overseas, and all of our income was earned here. Was because we've been slowly migrating and getting other things happening so that we've got location independent income going. But this is where you need to make a decision. We've talked a lot about government, about where their power comes from, about whether they're operating inside their power or whether they are in fact taking whatever power they jolly well please, and there's sweet FA that you can do about it. If you're okay with that, then great. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't work on anything else. Don't work on location independent income. Don't work on a plan B. Don't work on avoiding being that old guy that I met in Venezuela. But for me, for my choice, I am willing to change my entire life. I'm willing to live in a different country. I'm willing to change how I earn my living, and my wife is doing the same thing. I'm willing to change our social networks and the friends that we have and make new friends in order to have the ability to change jurisdictions. And here's why. Here's what gives me the willingness to do that. Number one, I've seen how bad it can get. Now, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know where Australia is going. I'm pretty sure it's not pretty. And I'm hoping, like I said, I'm going to keep fighting, and I'm going to keep on trying to turn it around because I love this country. The more I've traveled, the more I like Melbourne, right? That's been something that I've said countless times in my life. The more I travel around, the more I see of the rest of the world, the more I like it here. Okay, I like it here. But there's a cost to benefit ratio that you have to look at, and I like it here right now, but where are we headed? You know, I'm of the opinion that the Anglosphere, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the US, have kind of done. We're kind of doing this at the moment, right? In terms of our freedom, in terms of economically, in terms of even then the lifestyle that will flow out of that, all of that. We're kind of doing this. We're doing it to ourselves, to be clear. There's no inherent reason why that has to be the case, but we're kind of doing that at the moment, especially under COVID. But the rest of the world is this, right? The poorer parts of the world, they're riding on the coattails of the Anglosphere and the Western world and the technology that's been invented, etc. So they're having an easier time doing this. But also, many parts of the world understand tyranny. They lived under it. The former USSR, countries in South America and Central America that have lived under dictators, lived under socialism. A lot of these countries are really discovering, or not discovering, they discovered the pain that comes from giving the government too much power, and they're pushing back more against it than what we are here. There's that saying, hard times breed hard men breed good times breed soft men breed bad times. And I'm very much of the view that the Anglosphere is in that soft men breeding bad times era. That is the phase, the moment in history that we are in. And so it is my choice to have the option, the ability to say, I will not be that guy who grows old watching my children suffering because I didn't get a plan B in place. I want to talk about competition in government. When you start to think about government more as shopping malls rather than as some other holy thing, then the idea of trading them off against each other, actually looking and going, well, which shopping mall is offering me the best deal? If I'm going to lease in this shopping mall, they'll do this. If I lease in that shopping mall, it's more expensive, but they'll do that for me. That idea, we should be doing the same thing with government. And we're actually entering what I think is going to be a really exciting golden age, if I can call it that, of government competition. The UN and other bodies are trying to push against this idea, but there are countries that are really competing for your attention. They're competing for your money. They're competing for you to live there. And that is going to increase in a massive, massive way as time goes on. We're seeing throughout Asia special economic zones being created in various countries. South Korea's done it. Malaysia's done it. A couple of others have done it, where they're creating special areas specifically to give people tax breaks to try and attract them to come and live there, to come and work there, just to register their business there, even if they don't live there. The same thing is happening in Africa right now. Now, Africa might be a country that you look at and go, oh, it's a hellhole. I'd never want to live there. Well, fast forward 20 years, and I think you're going to be looking at it very, very differently. And if we're doing this and they're doing that, at some point there's a crossover. Now, I'm not saying, run away and move to Africa. I'm saying open your eyes to what's happening right around the world, all around the world, even in the places that we have been trained to write off. There are, I meet so many people that are like, no, but Australia is the best place in the world. Okay. But you do realize that Russians will tell you the same thing about Russia. Americans, we know, will tell you the same thing about America because they do it every chance you give them. North Koreans will tell you the same thing about North Korea. Every government has a vested interest in training you to believe that you're already in the best place in the world. That may be true. It may not. I love Australia, and I would love to have, up until relatively recently, I expected to live here most of my life, travel. I enjoy traveling. I wanted to travel a lot more. That's been hard recently. But ultimately, I always thought that Australia was going to be my home. And it's only been relatively recently that my wife and I are actually looking at each other going, you know what? If we grow old and die and are buried in a different country other than Australia, we're okay with that. We'll pick which one that is, and we'll pick based on what they're doing and whether we like what they're doing or not. But I'm actually okay with that. And there is going to be more opportunity than ever before to plant your flags, to steal the nomad capitalist terminology, to actually choose, where am I going to live? Where am I going to have my business? Where am I going to invest? Which passport do I want to hold? Those don't have to be the same place. You can pick. You can have your bank accounts in, let's say, Singapore, where they have the best banks in the world. You can get medical care in Malaysia, where they have some of the best retail hospitals. A retail hospital, you walk in, you get the thing done, you just pay money, you just pay for the medical service. Some of the best hospitals in the world. They're not in Australia. They're in other parts of the world. There are places that you can live with very, very little tax. There are places that you can live with very, very little government interference in your life. Now, there's trade-offs. Of course, there are trade-offs. But I want to challenge you to start thinking about it. And for those that are asking me, okay, where would I go, or how would I find out more, in the comments here, all I can say is, look, spend some time at Nomad Capitalist. Again, there's no relationship between me and him. As far as I know, he has no idea who I am or that I even exist. But that's where I've been researching this for over 4 years now. And instead of just regurgitating to you what I've learned from him, because I haven't walked this road yet, I'm in the process of walking this road right now. I don't really have a lot that I can teach you myself. So better that I just send you to the source where I've learned a lot from, nomadcapitalist.com, and spend some time there. Because leaving your entire life planted in one jurisdiction, whatever jurisdiction that is, to me seems incredibly risky. It's incredibly dangerous. Sovereign risk, the risk of what your government does, has now loomed large in my mind as one of the biggest risks that we face. Government is the most expensive thing that you will buy in your life. A lot of people think that their house is the most expensive thing they own. It's not. Your government is the most expensive, is the biggest expense that you pay for every single year. And if you're concerned about where your government is going, or if you are aware that you're not getting good value for your money, maybe it's time to start shopping around. That's really my key point with this last part here. The International Man, Doug Casey, is an excellent resource. Absolutely. Doug Casey, he was one of the first people to kind of, to not one of the first, but he was among the first to really internationalize his life. Hence, he's known as the International Man. Another great resource, another great person to be looking at, to learn. So if I can summarize, it is my opinion, when you ask the question, where does the government get its authority from, that it is essentially a moot point. Governments are no longer operating from a position of authority. They're operating from a position of power. Questions of social contract, voting, constitutions, bills of rights, it's all meaningless. When you look around the world, you ask yourself, what has worked? What has worked to actually reduce the power of government? To actually cause the government to really genuinely limit itself and stay within the boundaries defined? And the answer is really nothing. The limit, if you want to talk about Australia, if you want to talk about staying inside the one jurisdiction and fighting for it, the limit is what we accept. The government will never self-censor. It will never self-regulate. It will never reach a point where it goes, you know what, we're done here. We're not going to write any more laws. We're not going to keep on taking more power and more freedoms for ourselves. That day never comes. So the only way to stop it within a single jurisdiction is to have an enormous number of people stand up and say no more. Now, if you want to stay here and hope that enough people stand up and say no more, good for you. I am also staying here and I'm one of the people standing up and saying no more. But the back door is open for me, or I'm getting it open for me. I'm getting that plan B in place because there is no guarantee that enough people will stand up. People sort of have this view. There's this what's it called? Not status quo bias, but this bias towards thinking that everything will go back to normal. Oh, when COVID's finished, we're all going to go back to normal. It'll go back to the way that it was. I'm sorry. History tells us very, very clearly that that's not always the case. People in China, when Mao Zedong took power, it never went back to the way that it was. They never got those freedoms back. And to this day, 60, 70 odd years later, they're living with the consequences of all of what happened back then. You look at Venezuela, you look at Zimbabwe, you look around the world, there are plenty of cautionary tales where it wouldn't have mattered, really. I mean, you could have stood and stayed and fought tooth and nail. And I would encourage you to do that. I'm going to protest when I can. I'm putting out videos. I'm raising my voice. I'm doing what I can, but I'm very, very aware that I cannot win this fight. This fight will only get won if enough other people join me. And I can't necessarily even rustle up enough people to make that happen. My first and most crucial responsibility is not to Australia. It's not to Victoria, and it's not to you. It's to my wife, it's to my children, and it's to their descendants. And for that reason, I cannot see I cannot see a world in which not putting in place a plan B is okay. Now, again, you don't have to agree with me, but as someone who is responsible for my family, I can't simply sit here inside a single jurisdiction and go, well, I'm just going to cross my fingers and hope for the best. I hope that things work out okay. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. But at that point, you're no longer in any kind of control of your destiny. And your children and your grandchildren are going to experience the consequences of the decisions that you make now. So that really is my main focus today. Where does government power come from? In the modern world, who cares? Because they are taking it. And unless you can figure out something that I haven't been able to figure out in the last 12 years of being active politically and figure out how to stop that from happening, if you can't do that, then the alternative is to actually turn around and go, okay, how then do I respond? If I can't stop it, how do I respond to it? If this is reality, if the tide is going out on Australia, on the Anglosphere, if the tide is going out, you can't change it, no matter how big your bucket is and no matter how aggressively you keep scooping that water back up onto the shore. You're not going to stop the tide from going out. If you get lots of people to join you with buckets, you're still not going to stop the tide from going out. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't stand, as I've said in other slow chats before, as I've said in speeches before. I want history to record that there were people who stood. I want history to record that there were people who raised their voices. I don't care if it remembers me by name or not. I just want history to record that there were people who stood up for what was right when it mattered. But that doesn't mean you have to sit here and experience the consequences if 50% of the Australian public choose to go all the way and go full Venezuela. You don't have to be here and experience the consequences of that. So that's a lot and heavy. I've sort of covered a fair bit of ground of my own political evolution that's brought me to the point that I am at now. A little bit of sort of political philosophy. Nickel, I think you're quite right here. This is my biggest concern in all of this is that Australia is now getting the government that we deserve. We are literally, even worse, we're getting the government that we want. And if you look at the popularity polls, and I don't know how much faith I put in them, but if you look at the polls for Daniel Andrews, for Gladys Berejiklian, even for Scott Morrison, although to a lesser degree, people are loving what they're doing. People are loving it. Now, if that's what Australia is doing, what happens then? What happens to you? You can push back against that all you want. Can you change that tide? Can you save Australia? Or do you actually have a responsibility to focus more on your family and doing what you can do? Stuart has asked if I can just speak more about my thoughts on creating location-independent income. This is an area where, I mean, really, it's hard to not just end up down sort of the entrepreneurial sort of path on this, but ultimately, a location independent income pretty much requires you to be working for yourself, running a business, or to be self-employed in some way. There are a lot of ways to earn an income online these days. Everything from, for example, one of the things that I have in my back pocket, if it's absolutely necessary, I'm a reasonably proficient editor. I can edit videos quite well and quite quickly. If push comes to shove, I offer my services as a video editor. I can do that from anywhere in the world if I've got good internet. Right, I can edit corporate videos. I can edit whatever type of visual content someone needs edited. That's sort of, So there's that really I'm still just employed, self-employed. I'm still just trading my time for other people's money, billing by the hour, but it's something that I can do from anywhere in the world. Then there's all sorts of other options. There's putting your money into income earning assets, which doesn't have to be property. Property is one of the most well known. You can obviously, the shares with dividends, the returns on that are extremely low and potentially quite volatile, in my personal opinion. But for example, my wife and I are now part owners of some heavy equipment that gets used in the film industry. And every time that goes out on a job, we make a little bit of money back from that. It's nothing we can retire on, not even close. But these are the sorts of things that we're doing where that's an asset that is managed by another company. We don't have to be here for that thing to work. It wasn't a lot of money. We didn't put very much money into it. We don't get very much money back from it. But starting to diversify our sources of income. My wife is in the process of creating an online course. That's a very common and a very good way to earn money online. She's been a mortgage broker now for 8 or 9 years, and she knows her stuff really, really well. And there are people that want to understand that world. They're first home buyers or they're investors, and they want to know more about that. Well, she can help them. She can provide them with that knowledge. So that's one of the things that she's working on. And so on. The list is quite long. But it pretty much does require you to be willing to actually go into self-employment. And if you've only ever been an employee all your life, that can be a pretty big step. And I respect that. I understand that. But, excuse me, again, it's easy for me because I had that conversation with that elderly gentleman in Venezuela. I know what the face of a man looks like when he's living with that knowledge, when he's spent decades living with the knowledge that he could have done something for his family, but he didn't, when he's living with the knowledge that his grandson is malnourished and is suffering physical consequences as a result of malnourishment, as a result of him not doing what he could have done back when he could have done it. And that motivates me. Right now, you, unfortunately, you don't have that. You never saw that man's face, and I can't show it to you. I don't have a photograph. I don't, but I would suggest that these times are crazy enough, and this moment in history is uncertain enough to warrant some pretty significant changes to your life. Let me run this past you, actually. This is something I haven't talked about before. I wrote an ebook that I never released. It's literally in draft form on my laptop. It's called the 10, 100, 1000. And it's basically a book on how to start a micro business. It's like the beginner's steps, the walking before you, or crawling before you walk, really, the very earliest steps of entrepreneurship. And the philosophy is basically creating a micro business that will cost you, that will take no more than 10 weeks to get going, that will cost you no more than $1,000 to get going, and will require no more than 100 hours. So 10, 100, 1,000. So 10 weeks, 100 hours, and $1,000. Those are the thresholds. It's a little tiny micro business that you do while you're also working your job and doing other things. And the idea is this: for a lot of people, when they try to go into business, they swing for the fences on their very first attempt. And that often ends in complete disaster. They can lose their house, they can lose their marriage, their family, lose their life savings, because they go from being an employee to, I really want to open a cafe, or I really want to do this thing, and I'm going to throw everything into it. But they don't even know what they don't know, right? And that's not their fault. It's a different world. And so this idea of mine, and I did it myself. I'm not, this is something that I have done myself, is creating tiny, teeny, tiny little micro businesses. And in my case, it was actually with a 3D printer. I spent $330 on a 3D printer. And designed in some 3D design software. I designed a few little widgets and I sold them. I made a couple of $1,000s out of this little micro business, and then I shut it down because I'd learned what I needed to learn out of that little micro business. And as a very, very first step, to start to understand and start to discover what you don't know. I had enough orders that all of a sudden I needed a way to track them. I couldn't keep it in my head. I had too many orders going at one point in time. So I went to, Excel, the old Excel spreadsheet. I'm running my business off an Excel spreadsheet. I'm learning about marketing. I'm learning about billing. I'm learning about customer complaints. I'm learning about manufacturing and issues and quality control. All in this little teeny tiny micro business that is meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but it was meaningful in terms of what it actually taught me and what I learned from that. And I've done that with a few little things along the way. And now I'm involved in some much bigger things. And someone was asking earlier, they saw the go-kart tires down here in the corner of the shop. I've got a fairly large enterprise that's been underway now for 5 years. Thank you, Victorian planning permits at laws. We spent 3.5 years getting council approval and another 6 months getting dragged through VCAT and everything else. And we're at the point now where we're very close to finally being able to go into construction. And surprise, surprise, we're wondering whether we should, because is Victoria the right place to spend $5.5 million on a go-karting centre, given that the economy is going to be in the toilet and everything else? So there's some big decisions to be made there. But I've moved through from those early lessons, from these little teeny tiny micro businesses. The point wasn't the money they put in my pocket. The point was the lessons I learned that I've then been able to apply and move on and go on to bigger and better things. And yeah, I'm not a big business success. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm some guru. But I taught myself the hard lessons the cheap way, so that when I failed, it didn't cost me everything. It didn't drain the family's bank account by a meaningful amount. So my question is, if that's interesting, because I've never done anything with that little booklet. Like, it's nothing amazing. It's just this. It just breaks down the thought process behind this idea. Create a little teeny tiny micro business where you learn the lessons, and once you've learned the lessons, you can just shut it down again. It's not a big thing. It's not an expensive thing. Hopefully you make more money than it costs you. But even if you don't, it's only $1,000. So if that's interesting to you, if you'd like to actually get that, throw a comment in here, because that might actually motivate me to go back and redraft it and finish it. And then provide it to anyone that's actually interested in dabbling in the very beginning steps, the crawling phase of getting into business. That might be useful. I don't know. So if enough people say, hey, that's actually interesting, then I'll get off my lazy butt and finish that little booklet. Who's that guy on the wall in the background? I'm assuming that's my little picture in the corner. That's just my face up in the corner. Streamyard, the software that I'm using, wants a logo in the corner, so I gave it that picture of myself. So it's not actually on my wall. What are you doing? You'd be a senator. Easy. Drop this and hit politics. I give you. I'm not going to finish that sentence, but okay. It's not as easy as that. It's really not. It just isn't. We've got some fantastic senators here in Victoria. We've got Tim Quilty in Northern Victoria as a senator in Victoria, and we've got David Limbrick. Both have just done outstanding work through all these lockdowns, etc. But they got in on preferences, on preference deals, and there's a little bit of, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but there's a little bit of luck, there's a little bit of right place, right time involved in actually doing that. So it's not as easy as me just going, hey, I want to be a senator, and then all of a sudden magically I get voted in. It just doesn't work that way. I really wish it did. But yeah, it's not that easy. And even if I did, there's absolutely no guarantee that I would actually ever make a difference. It's right place, right time. If you happen to be a senator who holds the balance of power, then you get a seat at the table. You get to influence legislation. But if you're a senator, you successfully become a senator, but the government has an overwhelming majority or even just a slim majority, they never need your vote. That you'd never get a seat at the table. You never get any real influence. You get a platform, but you don't really get a lot of influence. Kingo Habner saying, life will only ever be what you want it to be. If it were free, it shouldn't be difficult. It may not be extravagant, but it should be full if we are free. Absolutely. And for me, I value freedom above what I value comfort, right? I literally just want to wake up in the morning and not have the thought in the back of my head of what the fuck's the Premier going to do today, and to not be going outside and absolutely. I mean, we don't. It's the boiled frog. We don't realize how many rules and regulations there are. Someone made a comment earlier that they're living in Vietnam and that Vietnam is far more free than Australia. In practical terms, that's absolutely correct. Most of the world is more free than Australia in practical terms, in terms of the stuff that actually affects you day to day. That is absolutely true. Someone was asking earlier about cryptocurrency, And I'm not a cryptocurrency expert. I hold a little bit of Bitcoin. That's it. I think I view cryptocurrency much the same way as I view gold bullion and silver. It's a hedge. It's a hedge against inflation, which I do believe inflation is ticking up at the moment. We are seeing US data clearly showing that inflation in the US has increased. I think inflation in Australia is at least double the official figure, possibly more. It has been for some time. I addressed that in a previous slow chat. The government has a vested interest in making the official inflation rate look lower than what real inflation actually is. That's to their benefit to do that. And I think they've been doing that now for 10 years or more. So cryptocurrency is its own whole kettle of fish. I'm not going to say whether you should or shouldn't have any, but it is. I think it's an interesting world to dabble in, and one of the reasons why I ultimately, finally, belatedly, actually got into it was because when I was in Venezuela, um, Venezuela per capita had the highest uptake of Bitcoin of any jurisdiction in the world. Was in Venezuela. Why? Because their own currency was worthless and was inflating away at tens of thousands of percent every year. And there were heavy government restrictions placed on the US dollar. And so what did they do? They turned to cryptocurrency. And there were entire businesses that just made their money in cryptocurrency, paid their employees in cryptocurrency. And those employees spent cryptocurrency wherever they could and then converted what they couldn't into local currency to spend in other places. So as a hedge, both in terms of financial hedge, but also in terms of it gives you options. It gives you the ability to earn and the ability to spend in ways that are outside of the control of the government and aren't influenced by the government's bad financial decisions, the inflation that they cause, etc. So I think it's something, it's my personal opinion that it's something that we should all at least know how to do. It's a world that we should all at least know how to operate in. Whether or not you choose to hold any is up to you, but I would really recommend it's worth taking the time to wrap your head around how to have a wallet, how to have cryptocurrency in that wallet, how to get paid by other people, and how to pay other people. I think that's well worth understanding. Okay, so there's lots of other comments that have come through. Yeah, How to Be Free in an Unfree World, Harry Brown. There's a lot of good stuff from Harry Brown. Very good read, very good book. I'm considering a book of my own, more on political philosophy. I'm not a heavyweight. I'm not an intellectual. I can't really advance thought in terms of political philosophy. But what I do believe I can do fairly well is communicate and take these ideas that are often expressed really badly in really kind of arcane or really academic sort of terms and break them down and actually make them digestible for the everyday person, because that's all I am. But yes, the How to Be Free in an Unfree World, very, very good book. I can recommend. Neville is saying when it comes to cryptocurrency, he's saying learn about it, make an informed choice. I agree. I think when it comes to cryptocurrency, I would go so far as to say you need to learn about it. You need to have the capacity to deal in cryptocurrency should the need arise. Dollar Vigilante for an overview on crypto. I'd strongly recommend Stefan Livera. He does a podcast on crypto. He's also someone that I know, and I know that he's not bullshitting. There's a lot of guys in the cryptocurrency space that have agendas. They're trying to sell you something. Stefan Livera is not one of those guys. So I would recommend just Google and find his podcast. Nicole, way past my bedtime. Catch you later. Well, thank you for being a part of it, Nicole. And Jack is saying, why would anyone expect better decisions to be made by third parties who pay no price for being wrong? Is one of the mysteries of our time. That's a paraphrase of Thomas Sowell. I know the quote that you're referring to. And Thomas Sowell is a wonderful, just for political philosophy. The way he speaks and the way he breaks it down is wonderful. And I highly recommend anyone that's interested in that side of things. Thomas Sowell is a good person to go to. So anyway, 2.5 hours in, it's probably time for me to call it a night. Gwen, thank you so much. I really appreciate your feedback. I do plan to keep it up. And if the day ever comes when I do leave Australia, I don't plan to fall silent. I plan to keep fighting. I plan to keep on communicating, because I think that's the one thing I can do. I'm certainly not a genius. I'm certainly not right about everything, but I seem to have an ability to digest and communicate. And that seems to be what people appreciate. So if that's what people want from me, I'm more than happy to keep doing that for as long as I am physically capable. And whether I do that from within Australia or from without, then so be it. That really doesn't make a lot of difference to me. But you've heard today where I'm at. That's a real kind of download of where I've come from and where I'm at now. I hope it's been of value. I hope I'm not asking you to agree with me, but I hope at the very least I've given you food for thought, and your conclusion after that thought might be that I'm wrong, and that's completely fine. But if tonight has got you thinking and has even just enabled you to better understand and articulate why I'm wrong, then that's still good. That's still a good outcome. It's still worth it from my point of view to spend the time, and I'm grateful that you spent the time. If you buy pizza with crypto, you're an idiot, and I find that ironic. Yes, so this is a crypto reference. The very first Bitcoin transaction ever made was a couple of Bitcoin for a pizza, which means now the guy paid a couple $100,000 for a pizza, which is hilarious. Oops. Goodness, the comments are coming in so fast I can't keep up. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate the feedback. Craig, yourself as well. Thank you. Lorraine, thank you. And thank you for your questions earlier on as well. Thank you to everyone that's made comments. I've put up so few of your comments. The comments have just been dropping through so quickly I couldn't possibly keep up. So I'm very, very grateful for all the interaction. I will go through and read all the comments later. Cos, thank you very much. Stuart, thanks for keeping us sane in District 9 tonight. Yes, we're all in District 9. And Mark, great chat, very insightful. Thank you. John Humphreys, sorry I couldn't make it tonight. Hopefully next time. Well, John, I'm going to hold you to that. Most of the viewers probably don't know who you are. I do, and I'm going to be dragging you kicking and screaming onto one of these when the time is right. Wayne, good discussion while I was working. Thanks, Topher. 100% people need to learn and have capacity around blockchain. Yep, I agree. Don't have to put all your eggs into one basket. Don't stick all your money in there, but at least understand it and know how to work with it. Oh, goodness. I'm being corrected here by Christopher. It was over 10,000 Bitcoin. That very first transaction made with Bitcoin for a pizza, it was over. There you go. I didn't know that, or I didn't remember that. So, yeah, millions of dollars for the pizza. That's he would be kicking himself right now. So Russell says thank you. Christopher says thank you. And Peter, this and trigonometry are my favorite. I'll have to check out trigonometry. I know of them, but I haven't actually ever watched their stuff. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate your company tonight. I hope you've found it worthwhile. For those of you that have stayed to the end, I'm just going to assume that you found it worthwhile, and therefore it was worth my while to be here and to do it. I'll be back next week. So there's going to be a mix of these where I'm downloading ideas and working through things. And then also there's going to be other ones like the one you saw last week with Matt Wong, and the week before that with Victor Tay, where I'm going to be just having a slow chat with somebody else who I believe is interesting and brings real value. And hopefully you agree and you'll come along for the ride for those as well. So I've got lots planned coming up in future. Very, very interesting guests and lots more to discuss during these very interesting times. What's that old Chinese curse? May you live in interesting times. Well, there is no question we live in interesting times, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So with that, after 2 hours and 34 minutes, thank you so much, and we'll see you again in coming weeks. Cheers.